Welcome to Dusk and Empires. Tonight, we'll wander through the legendary halls of Alexandria's great library, where scrolls held the wisdom of civilizations and scholars pursued knowledge beneath Mediterranean stars. If this sounds like your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let history carry you to sleep. Channel, Dusk and Empires, History for Sleep. Target runtime, 60 to 90 minutes. Close your eyes now, and let your body sink deeper into comfort. Feel the weight of the present moment lifting away, like mist dispersing in the morning sun. We are about to journey together to a place that existed long before our world took shape, to a time when the Mediterranean Sea was the center of all known civilization, and knowledge itself was considered the most precious treasure on earth. Picture yourself standing at the edge of the ancient world's greatest harbor. The year might be 300 years before the birth of Christ, or perhaps 200 years after. Time moves differently in this place we're visiting tonight. The salt air carries with it the scent of papyrus and ink, of cedar wood and burning oil lamps. Before you rises a city unlike any other that has ever existed, where the lighthouse of Pharos casts its beacon across waters traveled by ships carrying not just goods and gold, but ideas, stories, and wisdom from every corner of the known world. This is Alexandria, jewel of the ancient Mediterranean, and somewhere within its marble-columned streets stands the most magnificent building ever dedicated to human knowledge. Tonight, we will walk those halls together. We will meet the scholars who devoted their lives to preserving every written word they could gather. We will witness the rise and slow, tragic decline of the greatest library the world has ever known. Let the tensions of your day dissolve completely now. There is nowhere else you need to be, nothing else you need to accomplish. We have all the time in the world to explore these ancient halls, to understand how knowledge was gathered, preserved, and ultimately, heartbreakingly, lost to the ages. Breathe deeply, and let us begin our journey to the Library of Alexandria. In the year 331 before the Common Era, a young Macedonian king stood on a narrow strip of land between the Mediterranean Sea and Lake Mareotis, his cloak billowing in the coastal wind. Alexander the Great was 25 years old, master of an empire that stretched from Greece to the edges of India, and he was dreaming of a city that would outlast all his military conquests. The location he had chosen was perfect, a natural harbor protected from the worst Mediterranean storms, positioned at the crossroads where Africa met Asia, where the ancient trade routes of the Nile River met the sea lanes that connected the known world. Alexander would not live to see his city completed. He died just 8 years later in Babylon, his body racked by fever, his vast empire immediately beginning to fracture as his generals fought for control of the territories he had conquered. But the dream of Alexandria lived on, passed like a sacred trust to one of his most capable commanders, Ptolemy, who claimed Egypt as his portion of the divided empire and established a dynasty that would rule for 3 centuries. Ptolemy I understood something that many conquerors miss, something that would define not only Alexandria but the entire concept of what a great city could become. Military might could conquer territory, but only knowledge could conquer time itself. In the decades following Alexander's death, as Ptolemy consolidated his rule over Egypt, he began to envision something unprecedented, an institution that would gather together all human knowledge, every scroll, every poem, every mathematical treatise, every work of history and philosophy and medicine that existed anywhere in the world. The idea was breathtakingly ambitious. In the ancient world, books were rare and precious things. Each scroll had to be copied by hand, a process that could take weeks or months depending on the length of the work. Papyrus, made from reeds that grew along the Nile River, was expensive to produce and delicate to preserve. Most cities might have a few dozen important scrolls kept in temples or private collections. Ptolemy was imagining a place that would house hundreds of thousands. But Ptolemy had advantages that no other ruler possessed. Egypt was wealthy beyond imagination, fed by the predictable floods of the Nile River that deposited rich soil across the delta every year. The country produced not only grain enough to feed much of the Mediterranean world, but also the papyrus that served as paper throughout the ancient civilizations. More importantly, Alexandria's location made it a natural gathering point for scholars, merchants, and travelers from every corner of the known world. Greek philosophers fleeing political turmoil in Athens, Jewish scholars carrying ancient Hebrew texts, Egyptian priests preserving knowledge that stretched back to the time of the pyramids, Persian mathematicians, Indian astronomers, all would find their way to this new city rising on the Mediterranean coast. The physical construction of Alexandria was itself a wonder that took decades to complete. Ptolemy and his successors imported marble from the Greek islands, cedar wood from Lebanon, gold from Nubia. The city's main boulevard, the Canopic Way, stretched for miles, wide enough for 8 chariots to travel side by side, lined with columns and porticos that provided shade during the blazing Egyptian summers. Aqueducts brought fresh water from the Nile. Underground cisterns stored millions of gallons for times of siege. The harbor was protected by a causeway that connected the mainland to the island of Pharos, where the lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, rose more than 400 feet into the sky. But for all its material splendor, Alexandria's true purpose was intellectual. Ptolemy I established what he called the Mouseion, literally the shrine of the Muses, the Greek goddesses who inspired learning and the arts. This was not simply a library, but an entire complex dedicated to scholarship, something like a combination of a modern university, research institute, and national library all rolled into one magnificent institution. The Mouseion included lecture halls and laboratories, dining rooms and living quarters for scholars, botanical gardens where plants from around the world were studied and cultivated, even a zoo where exotic animals were observed and their behaviors recorded. This was Ptolemy's vision made real, a place where human knowledge would be gathered, preserved, and continually expanded. But creating such an institution required more than just magnificent buildings and unlimited funding. It required a systematic plan for acquiring every written work in the known world, and the Ptolemies approached this challenge with the methodical determination that had made them masters of Egypt. The methods they used to build their collection were sometimes generous, sometimes cunning, sometimes bordering on piracy. Ptolemy II, who succeeded his father, sent agents to every major city in the Mediterranean world with bags of gold and instructions to purchase any scroll they could find. No price was too high, no work too obscure. The agents bought original philosophical treatises from the Academy in Athens, medical texts from the temple schools of Mesopotamia, astronomical observations from Babylon, poetry from the Greek islands, historical chronicles from Phoenician merchants who had kept records of their travels for centuries. But purchasing scrolls was only one method among many. The Ptolemies also instituted a remarkable policy regarding ships that arrived in Alexandria's busy harbor. Every vessel was searched not for contraband goods or weapons, but for books. Any scroll found aboard a foreign ship was immediately confiscated and taken to the library, where teams of scribes would make copies as quickly as possible. The original scroll would be kept for the library's collection, and the copy, regardless of how inferior it might be to the original, would be returned to the ship's owner along with a modest payment for the inconvenience. This policy, which must have seemed heavy-handed to merchants and travelers, was extraordinarily effective. Over the course of just a few decades, the library acquired texts from India and Persia, Celtic songs recorded by traders who had traveled to Britain, astronomical observations from Chinese scholars, medical treatises from physicians who practiced in the remotest corners of the empire. Some of these works existed nowhere else in the world. When the original was lost or destroyed in its homeland, the copy in Alexandria became the sole surviving record of entire traditions of learning and literature. Perhaps the most famous story of the Ptolemies' determination to build their collection involves the official state copies of the great Greek tragedies held in Athens. These were the original manuscripts of plays by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, written in the playwright's own hands or those of their immediate students. The Athenians guarded these scrolls jealously, but they were willing to lend them to Alexandria in exchange for a massive deposit, 15 talents of silver, enough to purchase several warships. The scrolls were duly delivered to Alexandria, where teams of the finest scribes in the world, specialists in Greek poetry, began the painstaking work of creating perfect copies. But when the work was completed, Ptolemy III made a decision that scandalized the ancient world. He kept the original scrolls for Alexandria and sent the copies back to Athens, forfeiting the enormous silver deposit without apparent concern. From his perspective, the transaction was more than fair. Athens had received beautiful copies of their national treasures, and Alexandria had acquired the original manuscripts of some of the greatest works in Greek literature. These methods, aggressive and sometimes ethically questionable as they might seem to modern eyes, were extraordinarily successful. By the middle of the 3rd century before the Common Era, barely 50 years after Ptolemy I had conceived his grand vision, the Library of Alexandria housed an estimated 400,000 scrolls, with some ancient sources claiming the number eventually reached 700,000 or more. To put this in perspective, a typical scroll contained roughly the same amount of text as 10 to 20 pages in a modern book. The library's collection was equivalent to perhaps 50,000 modern volumes, a collection that would not be matched in size anywhere in the world for more than 1,000 years. But numbers alone cannot capture the true significance of what the Ptolemies had created. This was not simply the largest library in the world, but the most diverse, most international collection of human knowledge that had ever been assembled. Here, a scholar could compare Greek philosophical texts with Persian religious writings, Egyptian medical papyri with Indian mathematical treatises, Celtic oral traditions that had been transcribed for the first time with Chinese astronomical observations that stretched back for centuries. The library was not just a repository of existing knowledge, but a place where new knowledge was constantly being created through the interaction of different intellectual traditions. The scholars who came to work in Alexandria brought with them not only their expertise in their particular fields, but exposure to ways of thinking, methods of investigation, and philosophical assumptions that would never have encountered each other anywhere else in the ancient world. This was Ptolemy's ultimate achievement. He had created not just a building filled with scrolls, but an institution that would become the beating heart of intellectual life for the entire ancient Mediterranean world. For nearly 7 centuries, the greatest minds of antiquity would make pilgrimage to Alexandria, drawn by the promise of unlimited access to human knowledge and the opportunity to work alongside the finest scholars of their age. The dream had become reality. The Library of Alexandria stood complete, ready to welcome the first generation of scholars who would make it the wonder of the ancient world. In the early morning hours, when the Mediterranean dawn cast its first pale light through the high windows of the library, the sound that filled the halls was unlike anything heard anywhere else in the ancient world. It was the whisper of hundreds of scrolls being unrolled simultaneously, the scratch of reed pens moving across papyrus, the soft shuffle of sandaled feet on polished marble floors, and beneath it all, the quiet murmur of intellectual discovery, as scholars from every corner of the known world pursued questions that had never been asked before. The 3rd century before the Common Era marked the beginning of what historians would later call the Golden Age of Alexandrian scholarship. Under the patronage of Ptolemy II and his successors, the Mouseion had become more than just a library and research center. It was a community of the mind, a place where the most brilliant intellectuals of the age lived and worked together, supported by royal stipends that freed them from any concern except the pursuit of knowledge. The daily routine of these scholars would have been enviable to any academic in any age. They woke in comfortable quarters within the Mouseion complex, took their meals in common dining halls where conversations ranged across every field of human inquiry, and spent their days with unlimited access to the largest collection of scrolls in the world. There were no teaching obligations, no administrative duties, no need to seek funding or justify their research to practical-minded politicians. Their only responsibility was to push the boundaries of human understanding wherever their curiosity might lead them. Among the most remarkable of these early Alexandrian scholars was Eratosthenes of Cyrene, who served as the library's chief librarian in the middle of the 3rd century. Eratosthenes was what we might call a Renaissance man 2,000 years before the Renaissance, a mathematician and geographer, poet and astronomer, historian and philosopher. But he is remembered today primarily for one extraordinary achievement: he calculated the circumference of the Earth using nothing more than careful observation, geometric reasoning, and the systematic comparison of shadows. The story of Eratosthenes' calculation demonstrates both the intellectual rigor and the international scope that characterized scholarship at Alexandria. He had noticed, during his travels in Egypt, that at noon on the summer solstice in the southern city of Syene, the sun shone directly down a deep well, casting no shadow at all. This meant that Syene lay exactly on the Tropic of Cancer, where the sun appears directly overhead once each year. Back in Alexandria, some 500 miles to the north, Eratosthenes measured the shadow cast by a vertical pole at the same moment and found that the angle was approximately 7 degrees, or about 1/50th of a complete circle. If the Earth was round, as Greek philosophers had theorized but never proven, then this difference in shadow angles represented 1/50th of the planet's total circumference. Eratosthenes had assistants pace off the distance between Alexandria and Syene, multiplied that figure by 50, and arrived at a calculation for the Earth's circumference that was accurate to within a few hundred miles. This was not just a remarkable mathematical achievement, but a triumph of what we would now call the scientific method: careful observation, logical reasoning, and systematic measurement applied to answer a fundamental question about the nature of our world. But Eratosthenes was not content to stop with measuring the Earth. He created the first systematic map of the known world, establishing lines of latitude and longitude and attempting to place every city, river, and mountain range in its correct position relative to every other geographic feature. His map included not only the Mediterranean world, but extended east to India and China, north to Britain and Scandinavia, and south to the sources of the Nile River in the heart of Africa. Much of this information came from the travel accounts and merchant records stored in the library's vast collection, but Eratosthenes went beyond simply compiling existing knowledge. He applied mathematical principles to create a systematic framework that could accommodate new discoveries and correct old errors. Working alongside Eratosthenes was another remarkable figure, Apollonius of Perga, whose investigations into the mathematics of curved lines would not be surpassed until the invention of calculus nearly 2,000 years later. Apollonius wrote 8 books on conic sections, the curves formed when a plane intersects a cone at different angles. These curves, which he called ellipses, parabolas, and hyperbolas, seemed like abstract mathematical curiosities in the 3rd century before the Common Era, but they would eventually prove essential to understanding planetary motion, the trajectory of projectiles, and the design of telescopes and satellite dishes. The work being done at Alexandria was not limited to mathematics and geography. In the library's medical section, physicians were making discoveries that would influence healing practices for centuries to come. Herophilus, who had studied at the famous medical school on the Greek island of Kos, established what may have been the world's first systematic program of human dissection. This was controversial even in the ancient world, where religious beliefs generally required that human bodies be buried intact, but the Ptolemies protected their scholars from such concerns and provided them with the bodies of executed criminals for anatomical study. Through careful dissection and observation, Herophilus made discoveries that seem obvious to us now but were revolutionary in his time. He identified the brain, not the heart, as the center of the nervous system and the seat of intelligence. He distinguished between sensory and motor nerves, traced the path of blood through arteries and veins, and developed techniques for measuring pulse rate that remained standard medical practice well into the modern era. His anatomical treatises, written in the clear, systematic style that characterized Alexandrian scholarship, became the foundation texts for medical education throughout the ancient world. Working in the same period was Erasistratus, another physician whose investigations focused on the circulatory system. Through his dissections, Erasistratus discovered that arteries and veins were connected by tiny vessels too small to see with the naked eye, a finding that anticipated the discovery of capillaries by nearly 2,000 years. He also proposed that the heart functioned as a pump that moved blood throughout the body, a theory that was remarkably close to our modern understanding of cardiovascular function, though it would not be definitively proven until the work of William Harvey in the 17th century. The library's influence extended far beyond the natural sciences into literature, history, and textual scholarship. One of the most important projects undertaken during the Golden Age was the systematic editing and standardization of the great works of Greek literature. When multiple copies of the same work existed, they often differed significantly from one another, as copying errors, regional variations, and deliberate changes accumulated over time. The scholars at Alexandria set themselves the monumental task of creating definitive versions of the most important texts in Greek literature. This work was led by scholars like Aristophanes of Byzantium, who developed many of the editorial principles that modern textual critics still use today. He compared multiple manuscripts of the same work, identified passages that appeared to be corrupted or interpolated, and made reasoned judgments about which readings were most likely to represent the original author's intentions. His editions of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey became the standard versions throughout the ancient world, and many of the readings he established have been preserved in manuscripts that survive today. Perhaps even more importantly, the Alexandrian scholars developed the first systematic methods for organizing and cataloging large collections of scrolls. Callimachus, who worked at the library during the 3rd century, created what he called the Pinox, or tables, a comprehensive bibliography that listed every work in the library's collection along with biographical information about each author and a brief summary of each work's contents. This was not simply a list, but a sophisticated classification system that organized knowledge into categories and subcategories, making it possible for scholars to locate relevant material quickly and efficiently. The Pinox filled 120 scrolls and represented the first attempt in human history to create a comprehensive catalog of all recorded knowledge. Callimachus did not just list works alphabetically, but grouped them by subject matter and literary type, creating what we would now recognize as a systematic bibliography. His work established principles of library organization that influenced the development of scholarly research for centuries to come. The international character of Alexandrian scholarship is perhaps best exemplified by the work that was done to translate and preserve texts from other cultures. The most famous of these projects was the translation of Hebrew religious texts into Greek, a monumental undertaking that produced what came to be known as the Septuagint. According to later accounts, Ptolemy II invited 72 Jewish scholars to Alexandria and commissioned them to create Greek versions of the Torah and other Hebrew scriptures. The project took several years to complete, but the result was a translation that made Jewish religious and historical texts accessible to the entire Greek-speaking world for the first time. This translation work was not limited to Hebrew texts. Alexandrian scholars also worked to translate Persian religious writings, Babylonian astronomical observations, Egyptian medical papyri, and even Indian mathematical treatises that had made their way to Alexandria through the network of merchants and travelers who frequented the city's busy harbor. Many of these translated works exist today only because they were preserved in the library's collection, the originals having been lost when their homelands were conquered or when the languages in which they were written fell out of use. The golden age of Alexandrian scholarship was not just about preserving existing knowledge, but about using that knowledge as a foundation for new discoveries. The interaction between different intellectual traditions produced insights that would have been impossible within any single cultural framework. Greek mathematical methods were applied to Babylonian astronomical observations, resulting in more accurate models of planetary motion. Egyptian medical knowledge was combined with Greek anatomical theories, leading to new understanding of disease and healing. Persian philosophical concepts were integrated with Greek logical methods, creating new approaches to ethics and metaphysics. This cross-pollination of ideas was facilitated by the library's unique environment, where scholars from different cultures worked side by side, sharing not only their specialized knowledge but their different ways of approaching fundamental questions. A typical day in the library might see a Greek mathematician collaborating with a Babylonian astronomer to refine calculations of lunar eclipses, while nearby an Egyptian physician worked with a Persian philosopher to develop new theories about the relationship between mind and body. The physical environment of the library was designed to support this kind of collaborative intellectual work. The main halls were arranged so that scholars working in related fields would encounter each other naturally in the course of their daily routines. Gardens and courtyards provided spaces for informal conversations, while dining halls brought together researchers from different disciplines for meals that often extended into long evening discussions. Private study rooms offered solitude for intensive work, but even these were arranged in clusters that facilitated consultation and collaboration. The result was an unprecedented flowering of human knowledge that touched virtually every field of inquiry. Astronomy, mathematics, medicine, geography, literature, history, philosophy, engineering, all advanced simultaneously as the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world was brought together in one place and subjected to systematic investigation by the finest minds of the age. This was the golden age of Alexandria, a time when human knowledge expanded at a rate that would not be matched again until the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries. The scholars working in the library's halls could not have known that they were living through one of the most intellectually productive periods in human history, but their work would influence the development of human knowledge for more than 1,000 years to come. The morning mist rises from the harbor as we walk through Alexandria's streets in the 2nd century before the Common Era, past the towering columns of the Serapeum and toward the Mouseion complex where the greatest minds of the age have gathered. The air carries the scent of papyrus and ink, cedar wood from Lebanon, and spices from India, but there is something else in the atmosphere of this remarkable city, an almost tangible sense of intellectual excitement, as if the very stones know they are witnessing the advancement of human knowledge on a scale never before achieved. In the workshops and laboratories of the Mouseion, men whose names will echo through history are engaged in work that seems to us now almost miraculous in its precision and insight. These are not merely scholars in the abstract sense, but craftsmen of the mind, individuals who combine theoretical knowledge with practical skill, philosophical insight with mechanical ingenuity, creating innovations that would not be surpassed for more than 1,000 years. The most remarkable of these figures was Archimedes of Syracuse, who, while not permanently resident in Alexandria, spent extended periods working in the library and maintained correspondence with Alexandrian scholars throughout his career. Archimedes embodied the Alexandrian ideal of scholarship that bridged the theoretical and the practical,
the mathematical and the mechanical, the abstract and the immediately useful.
His mind moved effortlessly between calculating the value of pi with unprecedented accuracy and designing war machines that could destroy entire Roman fleets. The stories told about Archimedes have become legendary, but they reveal something essential about the intellectual culture of Alexandria. There was the time he became so absorbed in a mathematical problem that he forgot to dress and ran naked through the streets of Syracuse shouting Eureka, after discovering the principle of displacement while stepping into his bath. There was the day he claimed that with a long enough lever and a place to stand, he could move the earth itself, and then proceeded to demonstrate his point by single-handedly moving a fully loaded ship using an ingenious system of pulleys and gears. But behind these dramatic anecdotes lay rigorous mathematical work of extraordinary sophistication. Archimedes developed methods for calculating the areas and volumes of curved surfaces that anticipated integral calculus by nearly 2,000 years. His investigation of spirals led to insights about infinite series that would not be fully understood until the work of Newton and Leibniz. His hydrostatic principles became the foundation for understanding how fluids behave under pressure, knowledge that remains essential to engineering design today. Working alongside such luminaries was Apollonius of Perga, whose 8-volume treatise on conic sections represented perhaps the most advanced mathematical work of the entire ancient period. Apollonius approached his subject with the systematic thoroughness that characterized Alexandrian scholarship at its best. He began with basic definitions and axioms, then proceeded through hundreds of propositions of increasing complexity, each building logically on the ones that came before, until he had created a complete mathematical description of all possible curves formed by the intersection of planes and cones. The practical applications of this work were not immediately apparent, and indeed would not become clear until many centuries later when astronomers like Johannes Kepler discovered that planetary orbits follow elliptical paths. But Apollonius was not concerned with immediate utility. He was driven by what might be called pure intellectual curiosity, the desire to understand mathematical relationships for their own sake, confident that such understanding would eventually prove valuable in ways that could not yet be imagined. This faith in the ultimate utility of abstract knowledge was characteristic of Alexandrian scholarship and helps explain why the work done in the library proved so durably influential. The scholars working there were not constrained by demands for immediate practical results, but were free to pursue fundamental questions about the nature of reality, confident that their royal patrons would continue to support work whose significance might not become apparent for generations. In the field of astronomy, this approach produced results that were nothing short of revolutionary. Hipparchus of Nicaea, working in the 2nd century before the Common Era, used the observational records accumulated in the library over more than a century to make discoveries that transformed human understanding of our place in the cosmos. By comparing his own careful measurements of star positions with records made by earlier astronomers, Hipparchus discovered that the entire star field was slowly rotating relative to the Earth, a phenomenon we now call the precession of the equinoxes. This discovery required not only exceptional observational skill, but the kind of long-term perspective that was only possible in an institution like the library, where records were systematically preserved and made available to later researchers. The shift that Hipparchus detected was tiny, less than 2 degrees per century, but by comparing observations separated by more than 100 years, he was able to measure it precisely and calculate that the complete cycle would take approximately 26,000 years to complete. Hipparchus also created the first systematic star catalog, mapping the positions and apparent brightness of more than 850 individual stars. His system for describing stellar brightness, which divided stars into 6 categories or magnitudes, remained the standard method used by astronomers until the invention of modern photometric techniques in the 19th century. This catalog was not simply a list, but a coordinate system that allowed future astronomers to detect changes in star positions, the appearance of new stars, or the disappearance of familiar ones. Perhaps even more remarkably, Hipparchus used his mathematical skills to develop techniques for predicting the timing of solar and lunar eclipses with extraordinary accuracy. By analyzing Babylonian eclipse records that stretched back for centuries, records that had been acquired by the library through its systematic collection efforts, Hipparchus was able to identify the complex cycles that govern when eclipses occur. His predictions were so accurate that they were still being used by navigators and calendar makers more than 1,000 years after his death. The medical work being conducted at Alexandria during this period was equally groundbreaking. Building on the anatomical discoveries of Herophilus and Erasistratus, later physicians developed surgical techniques and pharmaceutical preparations that would not be surpassed until the modern era. The library's medical collection included not only Greek and Egyptian texts, but treatises from India describing surgical procedures, Persian works on pharmacology, and even Chinese texts on acupuncture and herbal medicine that had somehow made their way to Alexandria through the network of trade routes that connected the ancient world. One of the most remarkable medical figures of this period was a physician known to us only as the Anonymous of Alexandria, whose surgical manual, preserved in later Byzantine copies, describes procedures of astonishing sophistication. He developed techniques for cataract surgery that involved inserting a hollow needle into the eye to remove the clouded lens, a procedure that required not only exceptional manual skill but detailed knowledge of ocular anatomy. He describes methods for setting compound fractures using adjustable splints and pulley systems that anticipated modern orthopedic techniques by nearly 2,000 years. The pharmaceutical knowledge accumulated at Alexandria was equally impressive. Physicians there had access to medicinal plants from throughout the known world, brought by merchants who understood that exotic drugs commanded high prices in the city's markets. The library's botanical collections included detailed descriptions of hundreds of medicinal plants, often accompanied by illustrations that showed not only the appearance of each plant but the proper methods for harvesting and preparing therapeutic compounds from roots, leaves, bark, and flowers. Perhaps most remarkably, Alexandrian physicians began to develop what we would now recognize as clinical research methods. They kept detailed records of patient symptoms, treatments administered, and outcomes achieved, comparing different approaches to the same conditions and gradually refining their understanding of which treatments were most effective. These case studies, preserved on papyrus scrolls in the library's medical section, represent some of the earliest attempts at systematic medical research in human history. The engineering work being done at Alexandria was equally advanced. The city itself was a showcase of ancient technology, from the Pharos lighthouse with its system of mirrors and polished bronze reflectors that could project light visible 20 miles out to sea, to the elaborate aqueduct and cistern system that supplied fresh water to hundreds of thousands of residents. But beyond these major public works, Alexandrian engineers were developing mechanical devices that displayed an understanding of physical principles centuries ahead of their time. Hero of Alexandria, working in the 1st century of the Common Era, created mechanical devices that seem almost magical even by modern standards. His automatic theater featured mechanical figures that moved through elaborate dramatic performances without any human intervention, powered by a system of weights, pulleys, and rotating cylinders. His temple doors opened automatically when fires were lit on the altar, operated by the expansion of heated air in hidden chambers. Most remarkably, he created what was essentially the first steam engine, a hollow sphere that rotated when steam was forced out through curved nozzles attached to its surface. These devices were not mere curiosities, but demonstrations of fundamental principles of mechanics and thermodynamics. Hero understood that air expanded when heated and contracted when cooled, that falling weights could be used to store and release energy, that gear trains could multiply force at the expense of speed. His treatises on mechanics, pneumatics, and automation remained the most advanced works on these subjects available anywhere in the world for more than 1,000 years. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of Hero's work was his systematic approach to mechanical problems. He did not simply create isolated clever devices, but developed general principles that could be applied to a wide range of engineering challenges. His analysis of the 5 simple machines, the lever, pulley, wedge, wheel and axle, and inclined plane, became the foundation for all subsequent work in mechanical engineering. His understanding of gear ratios, hydraulic pressure, and the properties of compressed air-influenced machine design well into the modern era. The breadth of knowledge represented by these Alexandrian masters is difficult to comprehend from our modern perspective of academic specialization. A single scholar might be simultaneously a mathematician, astronomer, engineer, physician, and poet, moving effortlessly between calculating planetary orbits and composing verses, between dissecting human cadavers and designing mechanical devices, between philosophical speculation and practical problem-solving. This intellectual versatility was not accidental, but reflected the fundamental philosophy underlying Alexandrian scholarship. Knowledge was seen as unified, different aspects of a single reality that could be understood through the application of reason, observation, and mathematical analysis. The boundaries between different fields of study were much less rigid than they would later become, allowing for the kind of cross-disciplinary insights that produced the most significant advances. The daily life of these scholars was structured to support this kind of comprehensive intellectual development. They attended lectures on mathematics in the morning, participated in philosophical discussions over lunch, spent afternoons conducting experiments or making observations, and devoted evenings to writing and correspondence with colleagues throughout the Mediterranean world. The library provided not just access to scrolls, but a complete intellectual environment where the pursuit of knowledge was supported by every aspect of daily routine. The influence of these masters extended far beyond Alexandria itself. Their students carried Alexandrian methods and insights to every corner of the ancient world, establishing schools and research centers that perpetuated the intellectual traditions pioneered in the library. Their works were copied and recopied, translated into Latin, Arabic, and eventually into the languages of medieval Europe, forming the foundation upon which later scientific and philosophical developments would be built. This was the height of ancient learning, a time when human knowledge advanced at a pace that would not be matched again for more than a millennium. The masters of Alexandria had created not just individual discoveries, but an entire approach to understanding the natural world that would influence human thought for centuries to come. The position of chief librarian at Alexandria was perhaps the most prestigious intellectual appointment in the ancient world, carrying with it not only access to humanity's greatest collection of scrolls, but responsibility for the systematic organization and expansion of all recorded knowledge. These men, for they were exclusively men in the ancient world, were more than administrators, they were the guardians of human memory, charged with ensuring that the accumulated wisdom of civilizations would survive the rise and fall of empires, the wars and catastrophes that could destroy entire cultures in a single generation. The early chief librarians established traditions and methods that would influence scholarship for centuries. They were typically chosen not just for their expertise in particular fields, but for their ability to see connections across different domains of knowledge, to understand how astronomy related to mathematics, how medicine connected to philosophy, how literature illuminated history. They were expected to be scholars in their own right, making original contributions to knowledge while simultaneously overseeing the work of dozens of other researchers and the practical operations of the world's largest library. Xenocrates of Ephesus, the first chief librarian, established many of the principles that would guide the library's operations for centuries. He recognized that simply accumulating scrolls was not enough, that knowledge had to be systematically organized if it were to be useful to researchers. Under his direction, the library's collection was divided into major categories: mathematics and astronomy, medicine and natural philosophy, history and geography, poetry and drama, rhetoric and law. Within each category, scrolls were arranged alphabetically by author, with detailed catalogs that included not only the title of each work, but biographical information about its author and a summary of its contents. But Xenocrates made an even more significant contribution through his work on textual criticism. He recognized that many of the scrolls in the library's collection contained errors that had accumulated through generations of copying, and he set himself the task of creating reliable versions of the most important works in Greek literature. His editions of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey were particularly significant, as these were among the most copied and therefore most corrupted texts in the ancient world. By comparing dozens of different manuscripts, Xenocrates was able to identify passages that appeared to be later additions, lines that had been altered by copyists, and words that had been misunderstood or deliberately changed. This work required not only linguistic expertise, but a deep understanding of Greek poetry, history, and culture. Xenocrates had to distinguish between genuine variations that reflected different regional traditions and errors that represented simple copying mistakes. He had to understand the metrical patterns of ancient Greek verse well enough to recognize when lines had been altered in ways that disrupted the poem's rhythm. He had to be familiar with Greek mythology, geography, and social customs well enough to identify anachronisms or inconsistencies that might indicate later interpolations. The methods Xenocrates developed became the foundation for all subsequent work in textual criticism. He established the principle that the oldest available manuscripts were generally more reliable than later copies, but also recognized that age alone was not sufficient, that copyists' skills and the conditions under which manuscripts were preserved could be equally important factors. He developed systems of notation that allowed scholars to indicate their level of confidence in particular readings, marking passages that were certainly authentic, possibly corrupt, or definitely spurious. His successor, Apollonius of Rhodes, brought a different set of skills to the position. Apollonius was himself a poet, author of the Argonautica, an epic poem about Jason's quest for the Golden Fleece that was considered one of the finest works of Hellenistic literature. His experience as a creative writer gave him insights into the process of literary composition that proved invaluable in his editorial work, allowing him to understand not just what ancient authors had written, but why they had made particular stylistic and structural choices.
Under Apollonius's direction, the library began systematic efforts to collect and preserve works in languages other than Greek.
This was a recognition that human knowledge was not limited to the Greek-speaking world, but was distributed among all the civilizations that had developed writing systems. Apollonius sent agents to acquire Phoenician historical chronicles, Egyptian religious texts, Babylonian astronomical observations, Persian philosophical works, and even attempted to obtain manuscripts from India and distant China. This expansion of the collection created new challenges for organization and access. Scrolls in foreign languages had to be translated before they could be useful to most scholars, but translation itself was a complex and uncertain process. Languages differed not only in their vocabulary and grammar, but in their fundamental assumptions about how knowledge should be organized and expressed.
Mathematical concepts that were clearly understood in one culture might be virtually untranslatable into the intellectual framework of another. Apollonius addressed these challenges by establishing what we might call the first systematic translation program in human history.
He recruited scholars who were not only fluent in multiple languages, but deeply familiar with the intellectual traditions of different cultures. These translators worked in teams, comparing their interpretations and debating the best ways to render foreign concepts into Greek terminology. They created glossaries and reference works that explained technical terms, cultural references, and philosophical concepts that might be unfamiliar to Greek readers. The third great chief librarian, Eratosthenes of Cyrene, whom we have already encountered in his role as mathematician and geographer, brought yet another perspective to the position. Eratosthenes was fascinated by the practical applications of knowledge, by the ways that abstract learning could be used to solve real-world problems. Under his leadership, the library became not just a repository of existing knowledge, but an active center for research and innovation. Eratosthenes established workshops where scholars could conduct experiments, build mechanical devices, and test theoretical predictions against empirical observations. He encouraged collaboration between researchers working in different fields, recognizing that the most significant advances often occurred at the boundaries between established disciplines. A mathematician working with a physician might discover new applications for geometric principles in understanding the structure of the human body. An astronomer collaborating with an engineer might develop more accurate methods for measuring time or determining position at sea. Perhaps most importantly, Eratosthenes recognized that knowledge was not static, that it required constant re-evaluation and revision as new information became available. He established procedures for updating the library's collection, removing works that had been superseded by more accurate information, adding new discoveries, and cross-referencing related materials so that scholars could easily find all relevant information on any particular topic. This approach to knowledge management represented a significant advance in human thinking about the nature of learning itself. Earlier cultures had tended to view knowledge as fixed and authoritative, passed down from gods or ancient sages and requiring memorization rather than investigation. The Alexandrian approach, by contrast, treated knowledge as provisional and evolving, something to be continuously tested, refined, and expanded through systematic inquiry.
The fourth major chief librarian, Aristophanes of Byzantium, made perhaps the most lasting contribution to the organization of knowledge through his development of systematic bibliographic methods.
Aristophanes recognized that as the library's collection grew, it became increasingly difficult for scholars to locate relevant materials without comprehensive finding aids. He expanded the work begun by earlier librarians, creating detailed catalogs that included not only basic bibliographic information, but critical assessments of each work's reliability, originality, and significance. His biographical entries included not just the dates and places associated with each author, but evaluations of their contributions to their respective fields. He distinguished between original works and derivative compilations, between authentic texts and later forgeries, between works that represented genuine advances in knowledge and those that merely repeated existing information. These critical judgments, while sometimes controversial, provided invaluable guidance for scholars who needed to identify the most reliable and significant sources for their research. Aristophanes also developed what we would now recognize as citation systems, creating standardized methods for referring to particular passages in lengthy works, for indicating relationships between different texts, and for tracking the influence of ideas across multiple authors and time periods. These innovations made it possible for scholars to engage in the kind of detailed comparative analysis that characterizes modern academic research, building arguments by citing specific evidence from multiple sources and demonstrating the evolution of ideas through systematic examination of the literature. The daily operations of the library under these chief librarians involved an enormous amount of practical work that is often overlooked in accounts that focus on dramatic discoveries and theoretical advances. Thousands of scrolls had to be regularly inspected for signs of deterioration, with damaged sections carefully repaired or entire works recopied when necessary. The papyrus on which most texts were written was vulnerable to moisture, insects, and simple aging, requiring constant vigilance to prevent the loss of irreplaceable works. The library's staff included not only scholars and administrators, but teams of professional scribes who specialized in different types of copying work. Some focused on literary texts, developing exceptional skills in reproducing the complex meter and punctuation of ancient poetry. Others specialized in technical works, becoming expert at copying mathematical diagrams, astronomical charts, and medical illustrations with perfect accuracy. Still others worked exclusively on foreign language texts, mastering the scripts and special characters required for Phoenician, Hebrew, Egyptian, and other writing systems. The preservation of scrolls required sophisticated understanding of materials science that was remarkably advanced for the ancient world. The library's staff understood that different types of papyrus had different longevity characteristics, that certain inks were more resistant to fading than others, that storage conditions could dramatically affect the lifespan of written materials. They developed techniques for treating papyrus with various substances to make it more durable, for creating protective containers that shielded scrolls from moisture and pests, and for organizing storage areas to minimize handling damage. Perhaps most remarkably, they understood the importance of creating multiple copies of the most significant works, distributing these copies to other libraries and institutions throughout the Mediterranean world as a protection against loss. This early form of preservation microfilming ensured that even if the Alexandria collection were damaged or destroyed, copies of the most important texts would survive elsewhere. Many works that we know today exist only because Alexandrian librarians had the foresight to create and distribute copies centuries before the originals were lost. The chief librarians also served as diplomatic representatives of the intellectual community, maintaining correspondence with scholars, rulers, and institutions throughout the ancient world. They negotiated agreements for the exchange of texts, arranged for visiting scholars to have access to the collection, and worked to establish networks of cooperation that facilitated the international flow of knowledge. Their letters, fragments of which survive in later compilations, reveal sophisticated understanding of the political and cultural factors that could either support or hinder scholarly communication. Through all of these activities, the keepers of knowledge at Alexandria established principles and practices that would influence the development of libraries and scholarship for millennia to come. They demonstrated that preserving human knowledge required not just the accumulation of texts, but systematic organization, critical evaluation, and continuous maintenance. They showed that effective scholarship depended on collaboration, on the free exchange of ideas across cultural and political boundaries, and on institutional support that allowed researchers to pursue long-term investigations without concern for immediate practical applications. Most importantly, they embodied an approach to knowledge that valued both preservation and innovation, understanding that the wisdom of the past could only remain vital if it continued to evolve through contact with new ideas and new evidence. These were the true builders of human intellectual tradition, the men who transformed Alexandria from a collection of scrolls into a living center of learning that would influence the development of human knowledge for more than 7 centuries. The daily routine of an Alexandrian scholar was unlike anything that had existed before in human history, or that would exist again for more than 1,000 years. These men lived in comfortable quarters within the Mouseion complex itself, freed from concerns about housing, food, or income by the generous stipends provided by the Ptolemaic rulers. Their only responsibility was to pursue knowledge wherever their curiosity might lead them, to push the boundaries of human understanding through systematic investigation and careful reasoning. A typical scholar might rise before sunrise, not from any external compulsion, but from enthusiasm for the work that awaited him in the library's vast halls. After a simple breakfast of bread, cheese, and watered wine, taken perhaps in one of the garden courtyards where colleagues from different fields gathered informally to discuss their current projects, he would make his way to whatever section of the library contained the materials most relevant to his current investigations. The physical experience of working in the library must have been extraordinary. The main hall soared overhead, supported by columns of polished marble whose capitals were carved with images of papyrus flowers and lotus blossoms, symbols of the Egyptian learning that was being combined with Greek scholarship to create new forms of knowledge. Sunlight streamed through high clerestory windows, supplemented by hundreds of oil lamps that allowed work to continue well into the evening hours. The walls were lined from floor to ceiling with wooden shelves, each holding hundreds of carefully catalogued scrolls. The scrolls themselves were works of art as well as repositories of information, written on the finest papyrus in elegant hands, often decorated with illustrations that had been executed by master craftsmen. Mathematical works included geometric diagrams drawn with compass and straightedge, astronomical texts featured detailed star charts and planetary models, medical treatises contained anatomical drawings of remarkable accuracy and artistic beauty. The silence was not complete, but filled with the sounds of intellectual activity, the soft whisper of papyrus being unrolled, the scratch of reed pens on writing surfaces, the quiet shuffle of sandaled feet on marble floors. Occasionally, a scholar might murmur to himself as he worked through a difficult mathematical proof or puzzled over an obscure passage in an ancient text. Sometimes, 2 or 3 researchers would gather around a particular scroll, discussing alternative interpretations of a problematic passage or debating the merits of different approaches to a shared problem. The scholars had access to materials that represented the accumulated knowledge of human civilization. A mathematician studying geometric principles could consult not only the foundational works of Euclid and his predecessors, but also Babylonian mathematical texts that approached the same problems from entirely different cultural perspectives, Egyptian architectural treatises that demonstrated practical applications of geometric principles, and Indian mathematical works that explored concepts like zero and negative numbers that were unknown to Greek mathematics. This exposure to multiple intellectual traditions was one of the most distinctive features of Alexandrian scholarship. A physician investigating the causes of disease had access to Greek theoretical treatises, Egyptian practical manuals based on thousands of years of medical experience, Persian pharmacological works that described the therapeutic properties of exotic plants, and even Chinese texts on acupuncture and herbal medicine that had somehow made their way to Alexandria through the network of trade routes connecting the ancient world. The process of scholarly investigation was slow and painstaking, requiring not just intellectual ability but extraordinary patience and attention to detail. A scroll might contain the equivalent of 10 or 20 pages of modern text, but reading it required carefully unrolling the papyrus section by section, holding it at the correct angle to catch the light, and often dealing with damage from age, moisture, or insect infestation that made portions of the text difficult or impossible to decipher. Many scrolls contained no punctuation or spaces between words, requiring scholars to determine where one word ended and another began based on context and their familiarity with the language and subject matter. Abbreviations were common, particularly in technical works, and scholars needed to be familiar with the conventional shorthand used in different fields and historical periods. Foreign names and technical terms were often transliterated rather than translated, requiring knowledge of multiple languages and writing systems. The scholars developed remarkable skills in what we would now call textual analysis. When they encountered multiple copies of the same work that contained different readings, they had to determine which version was most likely to represent the original author's intentions. This required not only linguistic expertise, but deep familiarity with the author's style, historical context, and the transmission history of the particular text. They learned to recognize the types of errors that commonly occurred in copying, from simple misreading of similar letters to deliberate alterations made by copyists who thought they were correcting mistakes. The collaborative aspects of Alexandrian scholarship were as important as individual research. Scholars regularly consulted with colleagues who had expertise in related fields, seeking advice on technical problems, testing new ideas against informed criticism, and building on insights that emerged from interdisciplinary conversation. A geographer might work with a mathematician to develop new methods for map projection, an astronomer might collaborate with an engineer to design more accurate instruments for measuring celestial positions, a physician might consult with a philosopher about the relationship between mind and body. The afternoon hours were often devoted to writing, as scholars worked to record their discoveries and interpretations for future generations. This was not simply a matter of jotting down notes, but of crafting carefully structured treatises that would communicate complex ideas clearly and persuasively. The best Alexandrian scholarship combined rigorous logical analysis with elegant literary style, producing works that were both intellectually substantial and aesthetically pleasing. The process of writing on papyrus required particular skills and tools. Reed pens had to be carefully cut and maintained, ink had to be mixed to the proper consistency, and the papyrus itself had to be prepared and handled with care to prevent tearing or smudging. Corrections were difficult to make cleanly, so scholars often wrote preliminary drafts on wax tablets before committing their final versions to expensive papyrus. Illustrations were an important component of many scholarly works, particularly in mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. Geometric diagrams had to be drawn with compass and straightedge with perfect precision, as even small inaccuracies could make proofs impossible to follow. Star charts required accurate representation of the relative positions and brightness of hundreds of individual stars. Anatomical drawings demanded both artistic skill and detailed knowledge of human anatomy to be useful to medical students and practitioners. The evening hours brought different activities, often more social in character. Scholars gathered in dining halls for meals that extended into long philosophical discussions, debating questions that ranged across all fields of knowledge. These conversations were not idle speculation, but serious intellectual exchanges where ideas were tested, refined, and developed through collaborative dialogue. The mixing of scholars from different cultural backgrounds and areas of expertise produced insights that would have been impossible within any single intellectual tradition. Some evenings were devoted to formal lectures and presentations, where scholars shared their latest discoveries with their colleagues. These sessions served multiple purposes. They disseminated new knowledge throughout the scholarly community, they subjected new ideas to informed criticism that could identify errors or suggest improvements, and they inspired other researchers to pursue related investigations. The competitive aspects of these presentations motivated scholars to maintain the highest standards of rigor and originality. The library's collection included not only finished scholarly works, but extensive correspondence files that documented the international network of intellectual relationships that centered on Alexandria. Scholars maintained regular communication with colleagues throughout the Mediterranean world, sharing discoveries, requesting information about particular problems, and coordinating research projects that required resources or expertise available in multiple locations. Letters traveled slowly in the ancient world, sometimes taking months to reach their destinations, but the scholarly community had developed sophisticated methods for managing these extended conversations. Important discoveries were often announced in multiple letters to ensure that the information would reach its intended recipients despite the hazards of ancient travel. Complex mathematical proofs or philosophical arguments might be developed through exchanges that continued for years, with each letter building on insights developed in previous communications. The scholars also served as teachers, though not in the formal sense of modern university instruction. Advanced students, usually young men who had already received basic education in grammar and rhetoric, came to Alexandria to work with master scholars whose expertise in particular fields was recognized throughout the ancient world. This apprenticeship system allowed knowledge to be transmitted not just through written works, but through direct personal interaction between masters and students. The relationship between teacher and student was intense and personal, often lasting for years. Students did not simply attend lectures or complete assignments, but participated directly in their master's research projects, learning through hands-on involvement in the process of discovery. They copied manuscripts, verified calculations, conducted experiments, and gradually developed the skills and knowledge necessary to make original contributions to their chosen fields. This system ensured that Alexandrian methods and standards of scholarship spread throughout the ancient world as students completed their studies and returned to their home cities to establish schools and research centers of their own. The influence of Alexandria extended far beyond the physical boundaries of the library, creating an international community of scholars who shared common approaches to investigation, similar standards of evidence and argument, and commitment to the systematic advancement of human knowledge. The personal lives of these scholars were shaped by their dedication to learning in ways that set them apart from other segments of ancient society. Many remained unmarried, finding their primary emotional and intellectual satisfaction in their research and their relationships with colleagues. Others married late in life, often to women who shared their intellectual interests and could participate in their scholarly activities. The economic security provided by royal patronage allowed scholars to make choices based on intellectual rather than financial considerations. They could pursue long-term research projects that might not yield immediate results, investigate abstract theoretical questions that had no obvious practical applications, and maintain standards of rigor and accuracy that would have been impossible under commercial pressures to produce quick results. This freedom from economic constraint was essential to the character of Alexandrian scholarship. The most significant advances in mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy often required years of patient investigation, careful accumulation of observations, and gradual development of theoretical frameworks that could explain complex phenomena. The pressure to produce immediate practical results would have prevented the kind of fundamental research that produced the library's most lasting contributions to human knowledge. The daily lives of these scholars represented a unique experiment in human intellectual organization, one that would not be repeated until the establishment of modern research universities nearly 2,000 years later. For several centuries, Alexandria provided an environment where the pursuit of knowledge could be conducted under ideal conditions, free from external pressures and supported by the greatest accumulation of written materials that the world had ever seen. The shadows lengthen across Alexandria's marble columns as we move forward through centuries, and the once pristine halls of the great library begin to show subtle signs of change. The year is perhaps 145 before the Common Era, and though the morning light still streams through the high windows of the Mouseion, illuminating scrolls that contain the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world, something fundamental has shifted in the political and cultural landscape that supported this extraordinary institution for more than 2 centuries. The decline of the Library of Alexandria was not a sudden catastrophe, but a slow erosion that unfolded over centuries, the result of political upheaval, economic pressures, religious conflicts, and the gradual shift of intellectual life from Alexandria to other centers of learning. Understanding this decline requires us to look beyond the library itself to the broader changes that were transforming the entire Mediterranean world, changes that would ultimately make it impossible to sustain the kind of large-scale scholarly enterprise that the early Ptolemies had created. The first signs of trouble appeared during the reign of Ptolemy VIII, who came to power in 145 BCE after a brutal civil war that had torn Egypt apart for more than 20 years. Unlike his predecessors, who had viewed the Mouseion and library as essential symbols of their dynasty's commitment to learning and culture, Ptolemy VIII saw the scholars as political threats, intellectuals whose loyalty to abstract ideals might make them unreliable supporters of his regime. The purges began almost immediately after Ptolemy VIII secured his throne. Scholars who had supported his rivals during the civil war were expelled from the Mouseion, their stipends cancelled, their access to the library terminated. But the king's suspicions extended beyond matters of political loyalty to encompass intellectual activity itself. He viewed the international correspondence that scholars maintained with colleagues throughout the Mediterranean world as potential espionage, their debates about philosophical and scientific questions as possible sedition against royal authority. Many of the library's most distinguished researchers chose exile rather than submit to the king's restrictions on their work. They scattered throughout the Greek world, carrying with them not only their expertise, but copies of important texts from the library's collection. Rhodes, Athens, Pergamon, and other centers of learning welcomed these scholarly refugees, establishing new schools and research centers that began to compete with Alexandria for intellectual preeminence. This brain drain had immediate effects on the quality of work being conducted at the library. The scholars who remained were often those whose research was least controversial, whose investigations posed no possible challenge to political orthodoxy. The boldest theoretical investigations, the most innovative experimental work, the kind of speculative thinking that had produced Alexandria's greatest discoveries, became increasingly rare as scholars learned to avoid topics that might attract unwelcome royal attention. The library's acquisition program, which had been so aggressive and comprehensive under the early Ptolemies, also began to suffer from political constraints. International conflicts made it difficult to maintain the network of agents who had scoured the Mediterranean world for new texts. Economic pressures forced reductions in the budgets available for purchasing scrolls from private collectors. Most damagingly, other kingdoms and city-states, recognizing that knowledge was a source of power and prestige, began to restrict the export of important texts, keeping their own scholarly treasures rather than allowing them to flow to Alexandria. The rise of Rome as the dominant power in the Mediterranean created additional challenges for the library. Roman culture, at least in its earlier phases, was more practical and military-oriented than the Greek intellectual tradition that had flourished in Alexandria. Roman leaders valued engineering and administration over abstract mathematics, military history over philosophical speculation, legal precedents over literary criticism. They were willing to support scholarship that contributed directly to Roman interests, but they had little appreciation for the kind of pure research that had been the library's greatest strength. As Roman influence over Egypt grew, the Ptolemies found themselves under increasing pressure to demonstrate the practical utility of their scholarly investments. The library's research programs were gradually reoriented toward projects that could contribute to military technology, administrative efficiency, or economic development. While this shift did produce some valuable innovations, particularly in engineering and applied mathematics, it represented a fundamental departure from the spirit of free inquiry that had originally defined Alexandrian scholarship. The growing influence of Roman culture also affected the recruitment of scholars to work at the library. The best Greek intellectuals increasingly looked to Rome rather than Alexandria for career opportunities, drawn by the political power and cultural prestige of the emerging empire. Those who did come to Alexandria often did so as stepping stones to positions in Rome, rather than as permanent commitments to the scholarly life that the Mouseion had originally fostered. Religious changes posed another significant challenge to the library's traditional mission. The early Ptolemies had supported scholarship as part of a broadly syncretic approach to culture that welcomed intellectual traditions from throughout the known world. They had encouraged the translation and preservation of religious texts from many different traditions, seeing diversity of perspective as a source of strength rather than a threat to social cohesion. But as Alexandria became increasingly cosmopolitan, religious tensions began to emerge between different communities within the city. The large Jewish population, which had contributed significantly to the library's early development, particularly through the creation of the Septuagint translation of Hebrew scriptures, began to come into conflict with traditional Egyptian religious practices and emerging Christian communities. These tensions were not initially focused on the library itself, but they created an atmosphere of suspicion about foreign influences and unfamiliar ideas that made it more difficult to maintain the international, multicultural scholarly community that had been essential to the library's success. The practical challenges of maintaining such a vast collection of scrolls also became increasingly difficult over time. Papyrus, while more durable than modern paper, was still vulnerable to moisture, insects, and simple aging. The Mediterranean climate, with its wet winters and humid summers, created preservation challenges that required constant vigilance and regular maintenance work. As political and economic pressures reduced the resources available for these essential but unglamorous tasks, portions of the collection began to deteriorate. The copying program, which had been essential to preserving texts as original scrolls aged and became too fragile to handle, also suffered from reduced funding and the departure of skilled scribes who sought more secure employment elsewhere. Some of the library's most important works existed in only a few copies, making them vulnerable to complete loss if those copies were damaged or destroyed. The systematic creation of duplicate copies that had characterized the library's early centuries became sporadic and unreliable. Perhaps most damagingly, the intellectual culture that had sustained the library began to change in ways that made its original mission seem less relevant to contemporary needs. The Hellenistic world that had produced Alexandria's golden age was giving way to a new cultural synthesis that combined Greek, Roman, and increasingly Christian elements in ways that prioritized different kinds of knowledge and different approaches to learning. The Christian intellectual tradition, while it would eventually produce its own forms of sophisticated scholarship, was initially suspicious of pagan learning, particularly in areas like natural philosophy and mathematics where Greek achievements seemed to conflict with religious doctrine. Christian scholars were more interested in theology, biblical interpretation, and moral philosophy than in the kind of empirical investigation that had been central to Alexandrian science. They viewed much of the library's collection as not just irrelevant to their concerns, but potentially dangerous to proper religious understanding. The changes were gradual but cumulative, creating a situation where the library remained physically intact and continued to function as a center of learning, but had lost much of the intellectual energy and cultural support that had made it the wonder of the ancient world. Scholars still worked in its halls, students still came to study with recognized masters, important texts were still preserved and transmitted to future generations. But the institution was no longer at the cutting edge of human knowledge, no longer the place where the most innovative research was being conducted, no longer the inevitable destination for anyone seeking to understand the natural world or human culture. The library had become what many libraries would be throughout history, a valuable repository of existing knowledge, but not a dynamic center for creating new understanding. This transformation was perhaps inevitable given the political, economic, and cultural changes that were reshaping the entire Mediterranean world, but it marked the end of one of the most remarkable experiments in human intellectual organization that had ever been attempted. The decline was not uniform across all fields of study or all aspects of the library's operations. Some areas of research, particularly those with obvious practical applications like medicine and engineering, continued to flourish even as more theoretical investigations languished. The library's function as a center for preserving and transmitting existing knowledge remained largely intact even as its role in creating new knowledge diminished. But the changes were clearly visible to contemporary observers who had known the library during its golden age. The halls that had once buzzed with intellectual excitement began to seem quieter, more focused on routine scholarly tasks than on bold theoretical innovations. The international community of researchers that had made Alexandria the center of Mediterranean intellectual life gradually dispersed, as scholars found better opportunities and more supportive environments in other cities. The library's decline was not the result of any single catastrophic event, but rather the cumulative effect of changes that made it increasingly difficult to sustain the kind of comprehensive, international scholarly enterprise that the Ptolemies had created. Political instability reduced royal support for theoretical research, economic pressures forced cuts in essential programs, religious changes created suspicion of traditional forms of learning, and cultural shifts redirected intellectual energy toward different priorities and different institutions. By the 1st century before the Common Era, the Library of Alexandria was still a significant center of learning, still housed an enormous collection of texts, still attracted scholars from throughout the Mediterranean world. But it was no longer the unique institution it had been during its golden age, no longer the obvious center of human intellectual life, no longer the place where the boundaries of knowledge were being pushed forward most aggressively. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable to those who remembered the library's earlier glory. Where once the corridors had echoed with heated debates about the nature of mathematical infinity or the mechanics of planetary motion, now conversations focused increasingly on cataloging existing works, maintaining established traditions, and avoiding the kind of controversial investigations that might attract unwelcome attention from political or religious authorities. The network of international correspondence that had once connected Alexandria to scholars throughout the known world began to contract as political barriers made communication more difficult and dangerous. Letters that had once flowed freely between Alexandria and Athens, between Egyptian scholars and their colleagues in Babylon or India, now faced scrutiny from officials who viewed foreign contacts with suspicion. The free exchange of ideas that had been essential to Alexandria's intellectual vitality was gradually being replaced by a more cautious, insular approach to scholarship. Yet even in decline, the library remained a remarkable institution by the standards of its time. Its collection still dwarfed that of any other library in the ancient world, its scholars still possessed expertise that was unmatched in their respective fields, and its influence on intellectual development throughout the Mediterranean remained substantial. The seeds of future discoveries were still being planted in its halls, even if the conditions for their full flowering no longer existed. The tragedy was not that the library ceased to function entirely, but that humanity was losing something unprecedented and irreplaceable, a place where the pursuit of knowledge had been supported on a scale and with a comprehensiveness that would not be seen again for more than a millennium. The dream of gathering all human knowledge in one place, of creating an international community of scholars dedicated to expanding the boundaries of understanding, was slowly fading as the ancient world gave way to new political, economic, and cultural realities. The Mediterranean sun casts long shadows across Alexandria's harbor as Roman galleys approached the great city in the year 48 before the Common Era, their bronze rams cutting through waters that have carried the wisdom of ages to this center of learning. But these ships bring not scholars seeking knowledge, nor merchants carrying exotic texts from distant lands. They carry Julius Caesar and his legions, come to settle a dynastic dispute that will forever alter the fate of the library that has stood as humanity's greatest repository of knowledge for nearly 3 centuries. The civil war between Cleopatra VII and her brother Ptolemy XIII had been raging for months, transforming Alexandria from a peaceful center of scholarship into a battleground where political ambition threatened to destroy centuries of accumulated wisdom. The library, which had always stood above the petty conflicts of politics, now found itself directly in the path of military forces whose primary concern was victory, not the preservation of irreplaceable scrolls that contained the mathematical discoveries of Archimedes, the astronomical observations of Hipparchus, the medical treatises of Herophilus. Caesar's arrival in Alexandria was ostensibly to mediate the royal dispute and collect debts owed to Rome by the Ptolemaic dynasty. But the Roman general quickly became embroiled in the succession crisis, supporting Cleopatra's claim to the throne and finding himself besieged in the royal quarter of Alexandria by Ptolemy Xi's forces. What followed was a siege that would last for months, during which the accumulated learning of centuries hung in the balance as military necessity clashed with cultural preservation. The fire that broke out during this siege has become one of history's most debated disasters. Ancient sources disagree about its extent, its causes, and its consequences, but there is no doubt that flames consumed a significant portion of Alexandria's harbor district, including warehouses that stored scrolls intended for the library's collection. Some accounts suggest that Caesar himself ordered the burning of Egyptian ships in the harbor to prevent their use by his enemies, and that this fire spread beyond his intentions to engulf nearby buildings. Other sources place the blame on Ptolemy Xi's forces, claiming that they set fires deliberately as a military tactic, caring nothing for the cultural treasures that might be destroyed in their pursuit of political power. Still others suggest that the fire was accidental, the inevitable result of fighting in a densely built urban area where wooden structures, oil lamps, and military siege engines created countless opportunities for conflagration. What cannot be disputed is that the fire destroyed significant quantities of written materials that were connected to the library's operations. The harbor warehouses contained thousands of scrolls that had been recently acquired through the Ptolemy's systematic purchasing program, works that had not yet been catalogued and integrated into the main collection but represented years of effort by agents throughout the Mediterranean world. These included unique copies of works by minor authors, scientific treatises from distant lands, and historical chronicles that existed nowhere else in the world. Perhaps more damagingly, the fire destroyed much of the infrastructure that supported the library's operations. The copying facilities, where teams of skilled scribes had worked to create duplicate copies of important works, were located in buildings that were completely consumed. The workshops where papyrus was prepared and processed, essential to maintaining the physical medium on which ancient knowledge was preserved, were reduced to ash. The residential quarters where visiting scholars stayed during extended research visits were left in ruins. But the immediate physical damage, severe as it was, proved to be less significant than the broader changes that Caesar's intervention brought to Alexandria's political and cultural life. The Roman conquest of Egypt, completed when Augustus defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, transformed Alexandria from the capital of an independent kingdom into a provincial city within the Roman Empire. This change in political status had profound implications for the library's future. Under the Ptolemies, the library had been a symbol of royal prestige, a demonstration of the dynasty's commitment to learning and culture that justified enormous expenditures on scholarly activities that had no immediate practical value. The Ptolemaic kings had competed with other Hellenistic rulers to attract the most distinguished scholars, to acquire the rarest texts, to support the most ambitious research projects. This competition had driven continuous expansion of the library's resources and scope. Roman administration operated according to different priorities. While Roman culture eventually developed a deep appreciation for Greek learning, the empire's approach to scholarship was more pragmatic, more focused on immediate utility than on comprehensive preservation of human knowledge. Roman officials valued engineering over pure mathematics, legal precedents over philosophical speculation, military history over literary criticism. The transition from royal patronage to imperial administration meant that the library's budget was no longer determined by a king whose personal prestige was tied to the institution's reputation, but by bureaucrats whose primary responsibility was efficient governance of Egypt as a source of grain and tax revenue for Rome. Expenditures on abstract research that had no obvious benefit to Roman interests became increasingly difficult to justify to administrators who measured success in terms of agricultural production and civil order. The fire had also destroyed many of the personal libraries that belonged to individual scholars working at the Mouseion. These private collections often contained the only copies of works in progress, draft manuscripts that would never be completed, correspondence with colleagues throughout the Mediterranean world, and personal notes that recorded insights and observations that had not yet been incorporated into formal treatises. The loss of these materials represented not just the destruction of existing knowledge, but the elimination of potential future discoveries that might have emerged from ongoing research. The psychological impact of the fire on Alexandria's scholarly community was perhaps as significant as the physical destruction. For centuries, the library had seemed invulnerable, protected by its immense prestige, its royal patronage, and its essential role in Mediterranean intellectual life. The realization that political conflict could so easily threaten the accumulated wisdom of ages created a sense of insecurity that affected every aspect of scholarly activity. Scholars began to focus more heavily on preserving existing knowledge rather than creating new understanding, recognizing that their primary responsibility might be to ensure the survival of ancient texts rather than to push the boundaries of investigation. This shift toward conservation rather than innovation was understandable given the circumstances, but it represented a fundamental change in the library's mission from an active center of research to a passive repository of inherited wisdom. The disruption also accelerated the dispersal of scholarly talent that had begun during the political troubles of the 2nd century BCE. Many scholars concluded that Alexandria was no longer a safe haven for intellectual activity and sought opportunities in other centers of learning that seemed more stable and secure. Rome itself began to attract Greek intellectuals who could find patronage from wealthy Roman aristocrats interested in demonstrating their cultural sophistication. The copying program, which had been essential to the library's preservation mission, was particularly severely disrupted by the fire. The destruction of copying facilities meant that the systematic creation of duplicate manuscripts, which had protected important works against loss through accident or deterioration, could not continue at its previous scale. Many unique works that had survived for centuries in single copies were now vulnerable to complete disappearance if those copies were damaged. The fire also marked a turning point in Alexandria's relationship with the broader Mediterranean world. Where the city had once been seen as a neutral center of learning that transcended political boundaries, it was now clearly identified as part of the Roman Empire, subject to Roman political interests and Roman cultural values. This change affected the willingness of scholars from other regions to travel to Alexandria, and it reduced the international character that had been one of the library's greatest strengths. The immediate aftermath of the fire saw efforts to rebuild and restore what had been lost, but these efforts were hampered by political instability, economic constraints, and the gradual shift of intellectual activity toward other centers. Some important works were restored from copies that existed elsewhere, but many unique texts were gone forever, representing gaps in human knowledge that could never be filled. Perhaps most significantly, the fire and its aftermath demonstrated the fragility of human knowledge in the face of political and military conflict. The realization that centuries of accumulated learning could be destroyed in a matter of hours by forces that cared nothing for intellectual achievement created a new awareness of the need to distribute and preserve knowledge more widely. This lesson would influence the development of scholarship for centuries to come, leading to increased emphasis on creating multiple copies of important works and establishing libraries in multiple locations. The story of the fire also became a powerful symbol of the vulnerability of human cultural achievement. Later generations would use the burning of Alexandria as a cautionary tale about the importance of protecting intellectual freedom and preserving scholarly institutions against the destructive forces of politics and war. The fire came to represent not just a specific historical disaster, but a broader warning about the constant threats that face human knowledge in a world where political power often conflicts with cultural values. The recovery efforts that followed the fire revealed both the resilience and the limitations of ancient scholarly culture. While some of the most important works in the library's collection had survived in the main buildings that escaped the flames, the supporting infrastructure that had made Alexandria such a dynamic center of learning was much more difficult to restore. The network of international contacts, the community of resident scholars, the systematic programs of research and preservation, all had been disrupted in ways that would take decades to fully repair. By the end of the 1st century BCE, as Augustus consolidated Roman control over Egypt and established the administrative systems that would govern the province for centuries to come, the Library of Alexandria remained a significant institution but was no longer the unique center of human learning it had once been. The fire had accelerated changes that were already underway, marking a clear transition from the library's golden age to a new phase in its history where preservation would take precedence over innovation, and where political realities would increasingly constrain the pursuit of knowledge. The flames that consumed part of Alexandria in 48 BCE thus represent more than just a fire. more than just a military incident in a civil war. They mark a moment when human knowledge faced one of its greatest crises, when the accumulated wisdom of centuries hung in the balance, and when the future of learning itself was determined by the outcomes of political and military conflicts that had nothing to do with scholarship or culture. The morning sun rises over a changed Alexandria in the year 100 of the Common Era, its light falling upon a city that remains magnificent but whose character has been fundamentally transformed by more than a century of Roman rule. The great library still stands, its marble columns still gleaming in the Mediterranean light, its halls still filled with scrolls containing the wisdom of ages. But the rhythms of scholarly life have changed, adapted to new realities of imperial administration, Christian influence, and cultural priorities that differ markedly from those of the Ptolemaic Golden Age. Under Roman administration, the library had evolved from a royal symbol of dynastic prestige into something more recognizable to modern eyes, a great public institution serving educational and cultural needs that extended far beyond pure research. The Roman approach to scholarship, while less lavishly funded than the Ptolemaic system, was more systematic in some ways, more concerned with practical applications and the training of competent administrators, physicians, engineers, and teachers who could serve the empire's vast territories. The scholars working in the library during the Roman centuries were no longer exclusively supported by royal stipends that freed them from all concerns except the pursuit of knowledge. Instead, they were expected to contribute to the educational mission of the empire, training students who would go on to serve in various professional capacities throughout the Mediterranean world. This shift toward teaching and practical application produced different kinds of scholarly activity, less focused on abstract theoretical investigation and more concerned with synthesizing existing knowledge into forms that could be readily transmitted and applied. One of the most remarkable figures of this period was Claudius Ptolemy, who worked in Alexandria during the 2nd century CE and whose mathematical and astronomical treatises would influence scientific thought for more than 1,000 years. Ptolemy exemplified the Roman-era approach to scholarship, combining rigorous mathematical analysis with careful empirical observation to create comprehensive theoretical frameworks that could explain complex natural phenomena and make accurate predictions about future events. Ptolemy's Almagest, his great work on astronomy, represented the culmination of centuries of astronomical observation and mathematical analysis that had been accumulating in the library's collection since its earliest days. He drew upon Babylonian observational records that stretched back for nearly a millennium, Greek theoretical insights developed by scholars like Hipparchus and Apollonius, and his own careful measurements of stellar positions and planetary motions to create a mathematical model of the cosmos that could predict eclipses, planetary positions, and stellar movements with remarkable accuracy. But Ptolemy was not content simply to preserve and synthesize existing knowledge. His approach to astronomy demonstrated the continued vitality of Alexandrian scholarship, even under changed political and cultural conditions. He developed new mathematical techniques for analyzing complex astronomical phenomena, created improved observational instruments that allowed more precise measurements, and established methodological principles that would influence scientific investigation for centuries to come. His geography was equally influential, representing an attempt to create a comprehensive map of the entire known world based on mathematical principles rather than the informal geographical knowledge that had characterized earlier cartography. Ptolemy established systems of latitude and longitude that allowed any location on Earth to be specified with mathematical precision, developed projection techniques that could represent the curved surface of the Earth on flat maps, and created detailed charts that included not only geographic features but information about climate, population, and political boundaries. This work required access to travel accounts, merchant records, and survey reports from throughout the Roman Empire and beyond, demonstrating that the library's collection function remained robust even if its pure research mission had been modified. Ptolemy was able to consult sources that described regions as distant as Britain and China, Africa and India, synthesizing this information into a coherent framework that remained the foundation for geographic knowledge until the age of exploration more than 1,000 years later. The medical work conducted at Alexandria during the Roman period also showed remarkable continuity with earlier traditions while adapting to new circumstances and opportunities. The library's medical collection had grown to include not only Greek and Egyptian texts, but Roman military medical manuals that described treatments for battlefield injuries, pharmaceutical works that catalogued medicinal plants from throughout the empire, and surgical treatises that incorporated techniques developed in different regional traditions. Galen of Pergamon, though he did most of his work in Rome rather than Alexandria, made extensive use of medical texts preserved in the library and contributed to the Alexandrian tradition of systematic anatomical investigation. His comprehensive treatises on anatomy, physiology, and medical practice drew heavily upon the work of earlier Alexandrian physicians like Herophilus and Erasistratus, while incorporating new knowledge gained through his own dissections and clinical observations. Galen's approach to medical knowledge exemplified the Roman emphasis on practical application combined with theoretical understanding. His works were not abstract philosophical treatises, but detailed manuals that could be used by practicing physicians throughout the empire. He described surgical procedures with step-by-step precision, explained the preparation and use of hundreds of pharmaceutical compounds, and provided diagnostic guidelines that helped physicians identify and treat a wide range of diseases and injuries. The mathematical work conducted at Alexandria during the Roman centuries also maintained high standards while adapting to new educational and practical needs. Diophantus of Alexandria, working in the 3rd century CE, developed algebraic techniques that were far in advance of anything known elsewhere in the ancient world. His Arithmetica introduced systematic methods for solving equations that would not be surpassed until the work of Islamic mathematicians several centuries later. Diophantus approached mathematical problems with the same systematic thoroughness that had characterized earlier Alexandrian scholarship, but his work was more narrowly focused on specific techniques and applications rather than the broad theoretical investigations that had marked the library's golden age. His methods for solving indeterminate equations, his techniques for working with irrational numbers, his approaches to problems involving multiple unknowns, all demonstrated remarkable mathematical insight while serving practical needs for calculation and measurement. The preservation and transmission functions of the library became increasingly important during the Roman centuries as political instability and cultural changes threatened the survival of ancient texts. The copying programs that had been disrupted by the fire during Caesar's siege were gradually restored, but they operated under different priorities and constraints than had characterized earlier efforts. Roman administrators were more selective about which texts deserved the expense and effort required for systematic copying and preservation. Works that contributed directly to practical needs, education, and imperial administration received priority, while more abstract theoretical treatises or works that seemed to conflict with emerging Christian doctrine were often neglected. This selective preservation meant that some entire categories of ancient knowledge began to disappear from the library's active collection. The rise of Christianity created new challenges and opportunities for the library's mission. Christian scholars were initially suspicious of pagan learning, particularly in areas like natural philosophy and astronomy where Greek achievements seemed to conflict with biblical accounts of creation and cosmology. But as Christianity became more sophisticated intellectually, Christian thinkers began to see value in preserving and understanding ancient learning as a foundation for their own theological and philosophical investigations. The great Christian theologians who worked in Alexandria during the 3rd and 4th centuries, figures like Origen and Clement, developed approaches to scholarship that combined reverence for ancient wisdom with commitment to Christian doctrine. They argued that pagan learning, properly understood, could serve Christian purposes by providing tools for biblical interpretation, philosophical frameworks for understanding theological questions, and practical knowledge that could serve human welfare in accordance with Christian principles. This Christian appropriation of ancient learning helped preserve many texts that might otherwise have been lost, but it also led to significant changes in how knowledge was organized and understood. Works were increasingly valued for their compatibility with Christian teaching rather than for their contributions to understanding the natural world, and scholarly activity became more focused on commentary and interpretation than on original investigation. The library's educational function expanded significantly during the Roman centuries as Alexandria became an important center for training administrators, physicians, and teachers who would serve throughout the empire. Students came from all corners of the Roman world to study mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and rhetoric with masters whose expertise had been developed through access to the world's greatest collection of scholarly texts. This educational mission required different approaches to organizing and presenting knowledge than had been necessary during the library's earlier research-focused period. Scholars developed systematic curricula that introduced students to the most important works in each field, created textbooks that synthesized complex theoretical material into forms suitable for classroom instruction, and established examination systems that ensured students had mastered essential knowledge before advancing to more specialized study. The international character of the library's scholarly community persisted during the Roman period, though though it took on different characteristics under imperial administration. Rather than the community of independent researchers that had characterized the Ptolemaic era, the Roman library attracted scholars who served various functions within the imperial system while maintaining their research and educational activities. Some scholars served as advisors to provincial administrators, using their expertise in mathematics, engineering, and natural philosophy to solve practical problems of governance, construction, and resource management. Others worked as physicians to wealthy Roman families, combining their medical knowledge with access to the library's pharmaceutical texts to provide the best available healthcare to their patients. Still others served as tutors and teachers, preparing the sons of Roman aristocrats for careers in law, administration, and military service. This integration of scholarship with practical service to the empire created new opportunities for applying ancient knowledge to contemporary problems, but it also constrained the directions that research could take. Investigations that had no obvious utility to Roman interests became increasingly difficult to pursue, and scholars found themselves under pressure to demonstrate the practical value of their work to administrators who measured success in terms of immediate results rather than long-term contributions to human understanding. The physical condition of the library during the Roman centuries reflected these changing priorities and constraints. While the main buildings remained impressive and functional, the comprehensive maintenance and systematic expansion that had characterized the Ptolemaic period became sporadic and underfunded. Some sections of the collection were allowed to deteriorate as resources were redirected toward areas considered more essential to imperial needs. The copying and preservation programs continued, but at a reduced scale and with more selective priorities than had characterized earlier efforts. The systematic creation of multiple copies of all important works was replaced by a more targeted approach that focused on texts considered most valuable for educational and practical purposes. This change in preservation strategy meant that many works survived the Roman period only in single copies, making them vulnerable to complete loss if those copies were subsequently damaged or destroyed. Despite these changes and constraints, the library during the Roman centuries remained one of the ancient world's most important centers of learning and culture. The quality of scholarship, while different in character from the theoretical investigations of the Golden Age, maintained high standards and produced works that would influence human knowledge for centuries to come. The Roman period demonstrated both the resilience and the adaptability of the Alexandrian scholarly tradition. While the institution could no longer claim to be the unique center of Mediterranean intellectual life, it continued to serve essential functions in preserving ancient knowledge, educating new generations of scholars and professionals, and maintaining the continuity of learning that connected the ancient world to the emerging medieval period. The scholars working in Alexandria during these centuries could not have known that they were living through the final phase of the ancient world's greatest experiment in organizing and preserving human knowledge. But their work ensured that much of what had been achieved during the library's golden age would survive the political and cultural transformations that lay ahead, passing on to future generations the accumulated wisdom of antiquity. The call to morning prayer echoes across Alexandria's rooftops in the year 380 of the Common Era, a sound that would have been unknown in the city's classical heyday but now marks the rhythm of daily life in what has become one of Christianity's most important centers. The Great Library still stands, though its halls now witness debates between Christian theologians alongside the traditional discussions of mathematics and natural philosophy, and its collection includes not only the works of Homer and Euclid, but the writings of Christian fathers whose interpretations of Scripture shaped the intellectual life of the entire Mediterranean world. The transformation of Alexandria from a predominantly pagan center of learning to a Christian city had been gradual but profound, affecting every aspect of intellectual and cultural life. The process had begun in the first century of the Common Era, when Christian communities were established in the city's Jewish quarter, but it accelerated dramatically after the conversion of Constantine in the early 4th century made Christianity the favored religion of the Roman Empire. The relationship between Christian thought and the classical learning preserved in the library was complex and sometimes contradictory. Some Christian leaders viewed pagan philosophy and science with deep suspicion, seeing them as potential threats to pure religious faith that might lead believers away from revealed truth toward dangerous speculation about matters that should be accepted on divine authority alone. Others argued that ancient wisdom, properly understood, could serve Christian purposes by providing intellectual tools for defending and explaining religious doctrine. The great Christian school of Alexandria, which had been established by scholars like Clement and Origen in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, represented an attempt to reconcile these conflicting approaches. These theologians developed sophisticated methods for interpreting both scripture and classical texts that allowed them to preserve much ancient learning while subordinating it to Christian theological priorities. They argued that pagan philosophers had grasped partial truths about the nature of reality, but that only Christian revelation provided complete understanding of God's relationship to creation. This approach had significant implications for the kinds of scholarly work that could be pursued in Christian Alexandria. Mathematical and astronomical investigations were generally acceptable, as they revealed the mathematical order that God had imposed on creation and could be used for practical purposes like calculating the dates of religious festivals. Medical research was encouraged as a form of Christian charity that could alleviate human suffering in accordance with Christ's healing mission. But other areas of classical learning were more problematic from a Christian perspective. Philosophical works that seemed to promote materialism or deny the immortality of the soul faced increasing criticism from Christian authorities. Literary texts that celebrated pagan gods or described immoral behavior were viewed as corrupting influences that might undermine Christian moral teaching. Historical works that conflicted with biblical chronology or presented alternative accounts of creation were seen as potentially heretical. These tensions came to a head during the late 4th century, when Alexandria became the center of intense theological controversies that would reshape not only the city's intellectual life, but the entire structure of Christian doctrine. The conflict between Orthodox Christians and various heretical groups, particularly the Arians who denied the full divinity of Christ, created an atmosphere of doctrinal suspicion that affected all forms of intellectual activity. Theophilus, who became Patriarch of Alexandria in 385 CE, was a militant opponent of both paganism and heresy who viewed the city's classical heritage as a threat to Christian orthodoxy. Under his leadership, Christian mobs began attacking pagan temples and destroying artifacts that were associated with the old religious traditions. The Great Temple of Serapis, which had served as an auxiliary library containing hundreds of thousands of scrolls, was demolished in 391 CE, and its collection was either destroyed or dispersed. The loss of the Serapeum represented a catastrophe for the preservation of ancient knowledge that was comparable in scope to the fire during Caesar's siege centuries earlier. The temple had housed not only duplicate copies of many works in the main library, but also unique texts that existed nowhere else, particularly works on Egyptian religion, astronomy, and mathematics that had been collected over centuries. The destruction eliminated an entire category of human knowledge that could never be recovered. More ominously, the attack on the Serapeum demonstrated that Christian authorities were willing to use violence against institutions and individuals associated with pagan learning. The scholars who had worked in the temple's library were forced to flee the city or convert to Christianity, and many chose exile rather than abandon the intellectual traditions that had defined their lives. This exodus of scholarly talent accelerated the decline of Alexandria's academic community and reduced the library's ability to maintain its collections and continue its research programs. The most tragic symbol of this conflict between Christian orthodoxy and classical learning was the murder of Hypatia in 415 CE. Hypatia was one of the last great scholars in the Alexandrian tradition, a mathematician and philosopher whose lectures on Plato and Aristotle attracted students from throughout the Mediterranean world. She had maintained the classical approach to learning that valued rational investigation and philosophical dialogue, while trying to avoid involvement in the religious controversies that were tearing the city apart. But Hypatia's prominence as a pagan intellectual made her a target for Christian extremists who viewed her influence as dangerous to religious orthodoxy. Her friendship with Orestes, the Roman prefect of Alexandria who was engaged in a power struggle with Cyril, the Christian patriarch, made her a political target as well as a religious one. The combination of theological suspicion and political conflict created a volatile situation that erupted in violence during the Lenten season of 415. A mob of Christian fanatics, inflamed by sermons that portrayed Hypatia as a dangerous enemy of the faith, dragged her from her chariot as she traveled through the city. They took her to a church, where they stripped her naked and killed her with pottery shards, then dismembered her body and burned the remains. This brutal murder sent a clear message to Alexandria's remaining pagan intellectuals that their safety could no longer be guaranteed if they continued to pursue traditional forms of learning. The immediate aftermath of Hypatia's death saw a further exodus of scholars from Alexandria as academics throughout the Mediterranean world recognized that the city was no longer a safe haven for intellectual activity. Many fled to Constantinople, which was emerging as a new center of learning under imperial patronage, while others sought refuge in smaller cities where local authorities were more tolerant of philosophical diversity. The library itself was not destroyed in any single dramatic event, but it suffered from the gradual erosion of support and the hostile environment that made serious scholarship increasingly difficult. Christian authorities were selective about which parts of the collection deserved preservation and which could be allowed to deteriorate. Works that could be interpreted as supporting Christian doctrine or that had practical utility were maintained, while texts that seemed to promote pagan religious ideas or conflicted with biblical teaching were neglected. The copying programs that had been essential to preserving ancient texts were dramatically reduced as resources were redirected toward Christian manuscripts and theological works. Scribes who had specialized in copying classical texts found themselves unemployed or forced to shift their skills to reproducing biblical commentaries and saints' lives. The systematic preservation of ancient knowledge that had characterized the library for centuries was replaced by a more selective approach that prioritized Christian literature. Perhaps more damagingly, the intellectual culture that had sustained the library began to change in fundamental ways. The spirit of open inquiry that had characterized classical scholarship was replaced by an approach to learning that emphasized authority and orthodoxy over investigation and discovery. Questions that had once been explored through rational debate and empirical observation were now settled by reference to Scripture and the teachings of Church Fathers. This shift had profound implications for the kinds of knowledge that could be pursued and the methods that could be used in scholarly investigation. Natural philosophy, which had been one of the library's great strengths, became suspect when its findings seemed to conflict with religious doctrine. Mathematical astronomy continued to be valued for its practical applications in calendar calculation, but cosmological speculation about the nature and origin of the universe was discouraged as potentially heretical. Medical knowledge remained acceptable because it served the Christian mission of caring for the sick, but anatomical investigation through dissection became more difficult as Christian authorities expressed concerns about the treatment of human remains. Historical research was redirected toward documenting the lives of saints and martyrs rather than analyzing the rise and fall of ancient civilizations. The library's educational function also changed significantly during this period of Christianization. Where once it had served as a center for training scholars, physicians, and administrators in the classical tradition, it now became primarily an institution for educating Christian clergy and providing them with the theological and rhetorical skills necessary for their religious duties. The curriculum that had once emphasized mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy was restructured around biblical interpretation, theological debate, and Christian moral teaching. Students still learned classical languages and literary techniques, but these were now viewed as tools for understanding Scripture and defending Christian doctrine rather than as means for investigating the natural world or exploring philosophical questions about the nature of reality. Despite these profound changes, some aspects of the Alexandrian scholarly tradition managed to survive the transition to Christian dominance. Christian scholars like John Philoponus, working in the 6th century, demonstrated that it was possible to combine respect for classical learning with commitment to Christian faith. Philoponus wrote commentaries on Aristotle that preserved important insights about physics and cosmology while challenging aspects of ancient thought that seemed incompatible with Christian doctrine. His work on the nature of motion and the behavior of falling objects anticipated insights that would not be fully developed until the scientific revolution more than 1,000 years later. His critiques of Aristotelian physics, while motivated by theological concerns, used mathematical analysis and logical argument in ways that maintained the rigorous standards of classical scholarship. The preservation function of the library also continued, though in modified form, as Christian authorities recognized that many classical texts contained knowledge that could serve Christian purposes. Medical treatises were copied and preserved because they contributed to the Christian mission of healing the sick. Mathematical works were maintained because they provided tools for architectural and engineering projects that served the Church. Even some philosophical texts were preserved because they contained arguments that could be adapted to support Christian theological positions. But the selective preservation that characterized this period meant that entire categories of ancient knowledge were allowed to disappear. Works on pagan religious practices, mythological poetry that celebrated non-Christian gods, philosophical treatises that promoted materialism or denied divine providence, historical chronicles that conflicted with biblical chronology, all gradually vanished from the library's active collection as they were deemed incompatible with Christian orthodoxy. The international character of Alexandria's scholarly community was also fundamentally altered by the rise of Christian dominance. Where once scholars had come to the city from throughout the Mediterranean world regardless of their religious beliefs, the library now attracted primarily Christian intellectuals whose research was constrained by doctrinal considerations. The free exchange of ideas that had characterized the classical period was replaced by more cautious approaches to intellectual communication that avoided topics considered theologically sensitive. Correspondence with scholars in other cities became subject to scrutiny by church authorities who were concerned about the spread of heretical ideas. The international networks of learning that had connected Alexandria to the broader intellectual world began to contract as religious barriers made communication more difficult and dangerous. By the end of the 6th century, the Library of Alexandria bore little resemblance to the institution that had flourished during the Ptolemaic Golden Age. While it retained significant collections of texts and continued to serve educational functions, it was no longer the dynamic center of research and discovery that had advanced human knowledge for centuries. The transformation to Christian orthodoxy had preserved some aspects of ancient learning while eliminating others, creating an institution that served the needs of the Christian community but could no longer claim to be the repository of all human knowledge. The sun sets over Alexandria in the year 640 of the Common Era, its golden light casting long shadows across a city that has witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the flourishing and decline of learning, the preservation and loss of humanity's greatest accumulation of knowledge. For nearly 1,000 years, the Great Library has stood as a monument to human curiosity and intellectual ambition, but now the sounds echoing through its halls are not the whispers of scholars debating mathematics and philosophy, but the chants of prayers and the footsteps of soldiers whose presence marks another fundamental transformation in the institution's long and complex history. The Byzantine Empire, which had inherited Alexandria from the Romans, had maintained the city as an important provincial center, but its commitment to preserving the classical learning housed in the library had been inconsistent and increasingly constrained by religious considerations. The theological controversies that had marked the 4th and 5th centuries continued to affect intellectual life, as Christian authorities struggled to define orthodox doctrine while dealing with various heretical movements that challenged established teachings about the nature of Christ, the Trinity, and the relationship between divine and human nature. The Monophysite controversy, which divided Eastern and Western Christianity over questions about Christ's divine and human natures, had particularly severe effects on Alexandria. The city's patriarch and many of its Christian intellectuals supported theological positions that were condemned as heretical by the Council of Chalcedon in 451, creating ongoing tensions with Constantinople and Rome that affected every aspect of cultural and intellectual life. These religious conflicts had practical consequences for the library's operations and support. Imperial funding for scholarly activities became unpredictable as different emperors took varying approaches to the theological disputes that were fragmenting the Christian community. Some rulers supported Alexandrian scholars and institutions as a way of demonstrating their commitment to learning and culture, while others viewed the city's intellectual traditions with suspicion because of their association with condemned theological positions. The library's collection during this period reflected centuries of selective preservation that had gradually altered its character and comprehensiveness. Works that served Christian educational and practical needs remained well maintained and actively used, while texts that seemed irrelevant to contemporary concerns or potentially dangerous to Orthodox faith were allowed to deteriorate through neglect. The great classical authors, Homer and Virgil, Plato and Aristotle, survived because they were considered essential to rhetorical education and could be interpreted in ways that supported Christian teaching. Mathematical and astronomical texts persisted because they served practical functions in architecture, engineering, and calendar calculation that were necessary for both secular and religious purposes. Medical works continued to be copied and studied because healing remained an important Christian mission. But many categories of ancient knowledge had disappeared entirely or survived only in fragmentary form. The detailed historical chronicles that had recorded the rise and fall of ancient civilizations, the comprehensive collections of poetry and drama that had preserved the literary traditions of dozens of cultures, the philosophical treatises that had explored every conceivable approach to understanding reality, all had been reduced to small selections of works considered compatible with Christian doctrine. The scholars working in the library during the 6th and 7th centuries were primarily engaged in commentary and interpretation rather than original investigation. Their task was not to push the boundaries of human knowledge, but to understand and explain existing texts in ways that would serve educational and religious needs. This shift from research to pedagogy represented a fundamental change in the institution's mission that reflected broader changes in how knowledge was understood and valued. The copying programs that continued during this period focused heavily on creating standardized versions of texts that would be used in educational settings. Scribes developed new forms of script that were more efficient to write and easier to read than the formal styles that had characterized earlier periods. They created abbreviated versions of lengthy classical works that preserved the most important material while eliminating passages considered unnecessary or problematic. These editorial practices, while practical from a contemporary perspective, represented further losses of ancient knowledge as complete versions of classical works were replaced by shortened adaptations that omitted material considered irrelevant to current needs. The process was gradual and well-intentioned, but its cumulative effect was to reduce the comprehensiveness and accuracy of the texts available to future generations of scholars. The international connections that had once made Alexandria a center of Mediterranean intellectual life had also been severely weakened by political and religious conflicts. The Persian invasions of the early 7th century had disrupted trade and communication throughout the eastern Mediterranean, making it difficult for scholars to maintain correspondence with colleagues in other cities or to acquire new texts from distant regions. More fundamentally, the rise of Christianity had created new forms of intellectual community that operated according to different principles than the classical tradition that had originally defined Alexandrian scholarship. Christian intellectuals were more likely to seek communication with other Christian scholars than with pagan philosophers, and their investigations were increasingly focused on theological questions rather than the broad range of natural and human phenomena that had interested earlier generations of researchers. The physical condition of the library buildings reflected these changes in function and support. While the main structures remained impressive and functional, the comprehensive maintenance that had characterized earlier periods was no longer consistently available. Some sections of the complex were allowed to fall into disrepair as resources were concentrated on the areas considered most essential to ongoing operations. The famous museum, with its research facilities and residential quarters for scholars, had largely ceased to function as originally intended. The workshops where mechanical devices had been constructed and experiments conducted were closed or converted to other uses. The botanical gardens where plants from throughout the known world had been cultivated for scientific study were transformed into conventional monastery gardens focused on practical rather than investigative purposes. When Arab forces under the command of Amr ibn al-As conquered Alexandria in 640 CE, they found a city whose classical glory had long since faded but which still retained significant intellectual and cultural resources. The library, while much reduced from its ancient grandeur, still housed substantial collections of texts in Greek, Latin, and Coptic that represented centuries of accumulated learning. The question of what happened to these collections under Arab rule has been the subject of historical debate for more than 1,000 years. The famous story of Caliph Omar ordering the destruction of the library's contents, claiming that books were either unnecessary because they agreed with the Quran or dangerous because they contradicted it, appears to be a later fabrication that reflects medieval stereotypes rather than historical fact. Contemporary Arab sources suggest that the early Muslim rulers of Egypt were generally respectful of existing cultural institutions and eager to preserve knowledge that could serve practical and administrative needs. The Arabs had their own strong intellectual traditions, particularly in poetry, law, and astronomy, and they recognized the value of the Greek learning that had been preserved in Alexandria's libraries. The more likely scenario is that the library's collections were gradually dispersed rather than dramatically destroyed, as Arab administrators identified texts that could serve Islamic educational and practical purposes while allowing others to deteriorate through neglect. Works on mathematics, astronomy, and medicine were probably preserved and translated into Arabic, contributing to the flowering of Islamic science that would occur in subsequent centuries. Literary and historical texts that had no apparent utility to the new rulers were likely allowed to decay or were sold as scrap material. This process of selective preservation and gradual dispersal represented the final phase of the library's existence as a comprehensive repository of human knowledge. While significant portions of its collection survived in various forms and locations, the institution itself ceased to function as the unified center of learning that it had been for nearly 1,000 years. Some of the library's texts found their way to Constantinople, where Byzantine scholars continued to copy and study classical works. Others were acquired by Islamic scholars who translated them into Arabic and used them as foundations for new investigations in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. Still others disappeared entirely, representing permanent losses of human knowledge that could never be recovered. The scholarly traditions that had been developed in Alexandria also survived in modified forms, though they were no longer centered in a single institution. The methods of textual criticism that Alexandrian librarians had pioneered continued to influence how manuscripts were edited and preserved. The pedagogical approaches that had been developed for teaching classical literature, mathematics, and natural philosophy were adopted by educators throughout the Mediterranean world. The organizational principles that had made it possible to catalog and access enormous collections of texts provided models for later library development in Islamic, Byzantine, and eventually European institutions. The ideal of comprehensive preservation of human knowledge that had originally inspired the library's creation continued to motivate scholars and administrators who recognized the importance of maintaining cultural continuity across political and religious changes. Perhaps most importantly, the library's legacy included the recognition that knowledge is fragile and valuable, that human cultural achievements can be lost if they are not actively protected and preserved. The gradual decline and dispersal of Alexandria's collections provided a cautionary example of how intellectual traditions can disappear when political, economic, and cultural conditions no longer support their maintenance. The final disappearance of the library as a functioning institution marked the end of an era in human intellectual history. For nearly 1,000 years, Alexandria had served as proof that human beings could create institutions dedicated to preserving and expanding knowledge on a scale that transcended the limitations of individual lifetimes, cultural boundaries, and political changes. The lessons learned from both the library's achievements and its eventual decline would influence the development of scholarship and education for centuries to come. The recognition that knowledge requires institutional support, that preservation requires systematic effort, that intellectual freedom depends on political and cultural conditions, all emerged from reflection on what had been accomplished in Alexandria and what had ultimately been lost. As the sun sets on the last day of the library's existence as a center of comprehensive learning, the shadows that fall across its empty halls carry with them both the memory of unprecedented intellectual achievement and the warning that human knowledge, however vast and carefully preserved, remains vulnerable to the forces of political change, religious conflict, and cultural transformation. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the ancient world sleeps and dreams of what might have been, we can almost hear the whispered conversations of scholars whose names have been forgotten, whose discoveries were lost before they could change the world, whose insights into the nature of reality died with them in the halls of Alexandria. For every work that survived the library's gradual decline, how many others vanished completely, taking with them solutions to problems that would perplex humanity for centuries, answers to questions that would not be asked again for more than 1,000 years. The magnitude of what was lost when the Library of Alexandria ceased to function as a comprehensive repository of human knowledge cannot be measured simply by counting the scrolls that disappeared or cataloging the authors whose works no longer exist. The true loss was more profound, more far-reaching, representing not just the destruction of existing knowledge but the elimination of entire traditions of thought, approaches to investigation, and ways of understanding the world that might have led human civilization down very different paths of development. Consider the mathematical traditions that flourished in Alexandria for centuries, building upon Greek geometric insights, Babylonian algebraic methods, Egyptian practical calculations, and Indian innovations with zero and place value notation. The synthesis of these different approaches to mathematical thinking, conducted by scholars who had access to the original texts from each tradition and who could read them in their original languages, produced innovations that were centuries ahead of their time. We know from surviving fragments that Alexandrian mathematicians had developed techniques for solving equations that would not be rediscovered until the Renaissance. They had created geometric methods for calculating areas and volumes that anticipated integral calculus by more than a millennium. They had explored number theory in ways that addressed questions about prime numbers, perfect numbers, and mathematical series that would challenge later mathematicians for centuries. But how much more was lost? How many mathematical insights disappeared when the copying programs were reduced, when scholars fled to other cities, when scrolls were allowed to deteriorate because they seemed too abstract to deserve preservation? The gaps in our knowledge of ancient mathematics suggest that we are seeing only the tip of an iceberg, the small fraction of Alexandrian mathematical achievement that happened to survive in copies made elsewhere or in abbreviated versions that preserved conclusions without the full development of methods and proofs. The astronomical knowledge accumulated in Alexandria represents an even more poignant loss, because we can see from surviving works just how close ancient astronomers came to making discoveries that would revolutionize human understanding of the cosmos. Aristarchus of Samos had proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system in the 3rd century BCE, nearly 2,000 years before Copernicus. His calculations of the relative sizes and distances of the Sun and Moon were remarkably accurate given the limitations of ancient observational instruments. But Aristarchus's complete works are lost, surviving only in fragmentary quotations by later authors. We know that he developed mathematical methods for calculating planetary positions, that he made systematic observations of stellar positions and movements, that he created theoretical models that could explain complex astronomical phenomena. The disappearance of his complete treatises means that humanity had to rediscover heliocentric astronomy from scratch, a process that required more than 15 centuries to complete. How many other astronomical insights were lost with the decline of Alexandria? We know that the library housed observational records that stretched back for nearly a millennium, systematic measurements of stellar positions, planetary movements, and eclipse cycles that represented the most comprehensive database of astronomical information in the ancient world. When these records disappeared, later astronomers had to begin again with fragmentary observations, unable to detect the long-term patterns that require centuries of continuous data collection. The medical knowledge that vanished with Alexandria's decline is equally tragic to contemplate. The library had become a center for medical research that combined Greek theoretical insights with Egyptian practical experience, Persian pharmacological knowledge, and medical traditions from India, China, and other distant regions. The synthesis of these different approaches to healing had produced understanding of human anatomy, disease processes, and therapeutic methods that would not be matched until the modern era. Herophilus and Erasistratus had conducted systematic dissections that revealed the structure and function of the nervous system, the circulatory system, and the digestive system with accuracy that would not be surpassed for more than 1,000 years. Their successors had developed surgical techniques, pharmaceutical preparations, and diagnostic methods that represented the pinnacle of ancient medical achievement. But most of these medical advances disappeared with the library's decline, survived only in abbreviated summaries that preserved practical information while eliminating the theoretical frameworks that had made systematic medical progress possible. The result was that medieval medicine had to work with incomplete knowledge, lacking the comprehensive understanding of human anatomy and physiology that had been achieved in Alexandria centuries earlier. Perhaps most significantly, the loss of Alexandria's comprehensive approach to knowledge meant that later civilizations had to rediscover not just specific information, but the methods and attitudes that make systematic investigation possible. The Alexandrian scholars had developed rigorous standards for evaluating evidence, sophisticated techniques for comparing and synthesizing information from different sources, and systematic approaches to organizing and preserving knowledge that ensured its accessibility to future researchers. These methodological innovations were as important as any specific discovery, because they provided the foundation for all subsequent advances in human understanding. When the library ceased to function as a center for comprehensive scholarship, these methods were partially lost, surviving only in fragmentary form in scattered institutions throughout the Mediterranean world. The international character of Alexandrian scholarship was also crucial to its effectiveness and represents one of the most significant losses resulting from the library's decline. The ability to compare different cultural approaches to the same questions, to synthesize insights from multiple intellectual traditions, to test ideas against evidence gathered from diverse sources, all depended on maintaining a scholarly community that transcended political and cultural boundaries. When this international community dispersed, human knowledge became more fragmented, more culturally specific, less capable of the kind of comprehensive synthesis that had characterized Alexandria's golden age. Islamic scholars in Baghdad, Byzantine intellectuals in Constantinople, and European monastics in their scriptoria all maintained valuable intellectual traditions, but none had access to the comprehensive collections and international scholarly networks that had made Alexandria unique. The result was that advances in one region might not become known in others for centuries, if at all. Islamic mathematicians developed algebraic techniques that were unknown to their European contemporaries. European scholars preserved classical texts that had been lost in the Islamic world. Byzantine researchers maintained philosophical traditions that had disappeared elsewhere. The lack of comprehensive international scholarly communication meant that human knowledge developed unevenly, with different regions achieving different types of understanding while remaining ignorant of advances made elsewhere. The loss of Alexandria's comprehensive approach to knowledge preservation also had long-term consequences for human cultural development. The library had demonstrated that it was possible to maintain vast collections of written materials across centuries, that knowledge could be systematically organized and made accessible to researchers, that intellectual traditions could be preserved through political changes and cultural transformations. When this model of comprehensive preservation was lost, later civilizations had to develop their own approaches to maintaining cultural continuity, often with much less success. The result was that many entire categories of human knowledge disappeared completely, surviving only in fragmentary references that tantalize us with hints of what was lost. We know, for example, that the library contained extensive collections of poetry, drama, and prose literature from dozens of different cultures and languages. These works preserved not only artistic achievements, but historical information, cultural values, religious beliefs, and ways of understanding the world that would be invaluable to later historians and anthropologists trying to understand ancient civilizations. The disappearance of these literary collections represents a loss that extends far beyond the realm of scholarship, affecting our understanding of what human beings have achieved in their efforts to make sense of existence through artistic creation. How many epic poems, tragic dramas, philosophical dialogues, and historical narratives vanished with the library's decline? How many insights into human nature, social organization, and cultural development were lost when these works disappeared? The technological knowledge that was lost with Alexandria's decline is equally significant, though perhaps less immediately apparent. The library had served as a center for mechanical innovation where scholars like Hero of Alexandria developed sophisticated understanding of hydraulics, pneumatics, and mechanical engineering that would not be surpassed until the Industrial Revolution. But Hero's works that survive represent only a fraction of the technological knowledge that had been accumulated in Alexandria over centuries. The library contained treatises on architecture, engineering, metallurgy, and applied mathematics that described techniques and methods for solving practical problems that later civilizations would have to rediscover through centuries of trial and error. The loss of this technological knowledge meant that later societies had to reinvent solutions to problems that had already been solved, expending enormous effort and resources to achieve results that could have been available much earlier if the Alexandrian tradition of technological innovation had been preserved. The result was that human technological development proceeded more slowly and unevenly than might have been possible if the comprehensive approach to knowledge preservation that characterized Alexandria had been maintained. Perhaps the most profound loss represented by Alexandria's decline was the disappearance of the intellectual culture that had made its achievements possible. The combination of royal patronage that freed scholars from practical concerns, international cooperation that transcended political boundaries, comprehensive collections that made comparative study possible, and systematic methods that ensured high standards of accuracy and rigor, created conditions for intellectual work that would not be duplicated anywhere in the world for more than 1,000 years. The scholars who worked in Alexandria during its golden age had access to resources and opportunities that allowed them to pursue questions and investigations that were impossible under other circumstances. They could spend decades working on theoretical problems that had no immediate practical applications, confident that their research was valued and that their basic needs would be met. They could compare sources from different cultures and time periods, testing ideas against a broader range of evidence than was available anywhere else. When this intellectual culture disappeared, human knowledge development became more constrained, more limited by practical pressures and political considerations, less capable of the kind of long-term, comprehensive investigation that had characterized Alexandrian scholarship. The result was not just the loss of specific information, but the loss of a way of approaching knowledge that had proved extraordinarily productive. The legacy of lost knowledge from Alexandria thus extends far beyond the individual works that disappeared when the library ceased to function as a comprehensive repository of human learning. It includes the loss of methods, approaches, and institutional structures that had made unprecedented advances in human understanding possible, and whose disappearance ensured that later civilizations would have to rediscover not just specific facts, but entire ways of thinking about and investigating the world. The shadow of what might have been continues to haunt human intellectual development, reminding us that knowledge is fragile, that cultural achievements can be lost, and that the conditions necessary for systematic investigation and preservation require constant vigilance and support to maintain. As our long journey through the halls of the Great Library draws to a close, Let yourself sink deeper into the quiet comfort of this moment, feeling the weight of centuries settling gently around you like a soft blanket of time. We have walked together through marble corridors that no longer exist, listened to conversations that echo now only in our imagination, and witnessed the rise and fall of humanity's greatest experiment in preserving the accumulated wisdom of ages. The scholars whose footsteps once echoed through Alexandria's halls have been sleeping for more than 1,000 years, but their dedication to understanding, their reverence for knowledge, their patient work of preservation and discovery, continues to influence every book you read, every fact you learn, every moment when human curiosity reaches toward truth. In that sense, the Library of Alexandria has never truly disappeared. It lives on in every library, every school, every place where human beings gather to learn and to share what they have discovered. Feel your breath growing slower and deeper now, matching the ancient rhythm of waves against the Alexandria harbor, the gentle sound of papyrus scrolls being carefully rolled and shelved, the whispered conversations of minds engaged in the eternal human quest to understand our world and our place within it. The knowledge that was lost can never be recovered, but the spirit that created Alexandria's golden age, the recognition that learning is precious and fragile and worthy of our greatest efforts, that spirit remains alive in you. Let the tensions of the day dissolve completely now, like morning mist over the Mediterranean, knowing that you carry within you the same curiosity that drove Eratosthenes to measure the earth, the same wonder that inspired Aristarchus to imagine a sun-centered cosmos, the same dedication that motivated countless unnamed scribes to copy and preserve the thoughts of ages. In your own love of learning, in your own appreciation for the accumulated wisdom of humanity, the great library lives on. As you drift toward sleep, feel yourself connected to that long chain of human seekers who have asked questions, pursued answers, and worked to preserve what they discovered for future generations. Rest now in the knowledge that while buildings may crumble and scrolls may turn to dust, the human desire to understand, to learn, to grow in wisdom, remains as eternal as the stars that Alexandrian astronomers once mapped with such patient care. Sleep well, knowing that in dreams, the great library still stands, its halls filled with light and learning, its scholars still pursuing the endless questions that make us human. In the realm of memory and imagination, no knowledge is ever truly lost, and the conversation between past and future continues in the eternal present of the seeking mind. If you're still awake, that's okay. Just close your eyes and let the story carry you. Subscribe to History for Sleep for a new story every week. Sweet dreams.